empty pink sneakers by the car wheel, and silence stretched out for 30 years. In June 1995, 6-year-old Morgan Nick was catching fireflies on a baseball field, unaware that a predator was already watching her from the darkness. This is the story of a mother who challenged time itself and of a scientific breakthrough in 2024 that finally unmasks the killer. How did one evening in a quiet Arkansas town change America forever? And where had the truth been hiding all this time? Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. For the residents of the small town of Alma, nestled among the vast fields of Arkansas, the evening of June 9, 1995, felt like the perfect embodiment of a southern summer. The air at that time of year was always special there, heavy, humid, saturated with the thick scent of freshly cut grass and sun-baked earth. In places like this, life moved at a leisurely pace, governed not by the rhythm of big cities, but by the changing seasons and the schedule of local sports games. Alma was the kind of settlement where everyone knew their neighbor by name, and the concept of danger was limited to unusual weather or a broken piece of farm equipment. Doors were rarely locked, and children were allowed to roam freely without a hint of fear, under the belief that the whole town was one big, safe family. That evening, the center of gravity for the entire community was the Little League baseball stadium. For Alma, this was more than just a sporting event. It was a social ritual, a moment of unity. The stands were packed. Parents, teachers, local farmers, and shopkeepers all gathered to cheer for their children. Under the tall floodlight poles slicing through the twilight, the familiar hum filled the air. Shouts of fans, the crack of bat-meeting ball, the sound of popcorn machines. Among the bustle stood 6-year-old Morgan Nick. She was impossible to miss. A mop of light curly hair constantly in motion, and that carefree child's smile revealing silver crowns on her teeth. Morgan was the embodiment of what would later be called a sunshine child. Energetic, curious, always striving to be at the center of everything. She wore a simple green t-shirt and shorts, and on her feet were those same pink sneakers that would later become the most recognizable and tragic symbol of the case. Around 10:30 p.m., as the game neared its end, Morgan approached her mother, Colleen Nick. She was bored sitting still while the adults discussed the score and asked if she could go with friends to the edge of the parking lot to catch fireflies. Colleen paused for a moment, looking out at the field. A mother's instinct is a subtle thing, but at that moment, nothing in Alma foreshadowed trouble. Right in front of her were hundreds of familiar faces. The stadium was brightly lit, and the parking lot was only a few dozen steps away. Colleen gave permission, firmly instructing her daughter not to go far and to stay within sight. Morgan and 2 friends, Ty and another girl, ran toward the border between light and shadow. Colleen glanced their way from time to time, watching the small figures dart between parked cars, laughing and trying to scoop the glowing lights from the grass with their hands. It was a scene of pure idyll, a moment meant to remain in memory as a warm childhood memory. But at exactly 10:45 p.m., that idyll shattered. The game ended, and the crowd of spectators poured toward their vehicles. Ty and his friend returned to their parents, but when Colleen looked again, Morgan was not among them. When she asked where her daughter was, the children answered casually. Morgan had stayed by her mother's car to shake sand out of her sneakers. Colleen walked quickly toward her old Nissan. She expected to see her daughter squatting by the wheel or to hear her voice, but the parking lot greeted her with deafening silence. There, on the asphalt beside the car, stood the pink children's sneakers, placed so neatly it looked as though Morgan had simply vanished out of them in an instant. Colleen's scream tore through the quiet night stadium, ending the old Alma forever. In that moment, the mother did not yet know that the engine of a red truck was already starting and pulling out of the parking lot. She did not know that the search beginning at that second would stretch across 30 years. For her, time stopped right there, by the car wheel, next to the empty pink sneakers of her sunshine child. Her loved ones called her a sunshine child, and it was not just a pretty phrase. Morgan possessed a rare childhood energy capable of bringing any space to life. Her appearance was classic for a little Arkansas girl, a mop of sun-bleached blonde hair and piercing blue eyes always full of lively curiosity. But one detail later became the most bitter identifier for investigators: 5 silver crowns on her baby teeth. In June 1995, they were merely part of her childish smile. Years later, those crowns would be searched for in photographs and descriptions across the country, hoping for a miracle. Morgan's life was steeped in what the family called her pink world. She adored the color in every form, from dresses and bows to her pink toothbrush. Even her participation in the Girl Scouts was, for her, not just a game, but a sincere way to make the world a little better and kinder. She embodied absolute purity and that boundless trust in others that adults irreversibly lose with age. At the center of this small universe was her mother, Colleen Nick. As a single mother, she created a world for her children built on unbreakable emotional connection and love. Their home in the Ozarks had no luxury, but it held something far more valuable: complete, unconditional safety. Morgan was the child who could not fall asleep without long evening talks with Mom about everything that happened during the day. Every morning began with hugs. Every evening ended with the promise of a new game. There was also one silent witness to Morgan's happy childhood: a cat named Emily. That fateful evening, Emily, as usual, waited on the doorstep for her little owner. She would keep waiting for another 19 years. That cat became a living symbol of time forever frozen inside their home. Emily grew old and died in rooms where toys, clothes, and pink trinkets remained untouched for decades, waiting for the return of an owner who had only stepped away for a few minutes. In the mid-1990s, Alma seemed like a place where evil simply could not exist. Parents raised children together, and the baseball stadium during a game felt safer than one's own living room. Morgan's disappearance became a collective loss of innocence for the entire state of Arkansas. Before that night, the abduction of a child by a stranger seemed like something from distant news reports or thriller movies. When a girl known to nearly every family in town vanished, the air in Alma changed. Neighbors began looking at each other with suspicion, and parents started anxiously clutching their children's hands even on ordinary park walks. Morgan left behind a vacuum that could not be filled. She had been the sun around which the Nick family revolved, and when that sun went out, Colleen was plunged into total darkness. It was in that darkness that the steel resolve of a mother who refused to accept the role of victim began to form. Colleen decided that if her daughter could not come home on her own, she would turn the whole world upside down to find her. But in those first hours, she still believed it was only a terrible mistake, and that Morgan would soon emerge from the shadows of the trees with hands full of fireflies. 10:30 p.m. The Alma Stadium was gradually sinking into the usual post-game bustle. The final whistle had already sounded and organized movement began in the stands, people folding chairs, exchanging impressions of the game, and slowly heading toward the exits. At that moment, Morgan, together with her friends, 8-year-old Ty and another girl, was only a few dozen meters from the bleachers at the edge of the illuminated parking lot. In the children's minds, this space was simply an extension of the stadium, equally safe and filled with familiar adults. Later, during numerous interviews, the children would tell detectives details that forced the investigation to look at the events of that evening in a new light. While they were running through tall grass trying to catch the last fireflies, a man was intently watching them. He stood beside a red Ford truck with a white camper shell, parked in the farthest and darkest corner of the lot, where the stadium floodlights barely reached the ground. To the children, he was just a strange man, another adult in the crowd whom they paid little attention to, absorbed in their game. 10:45 p.m. became the point of no return. Morgan's friends decided it was time to go back to their parents and headed toward the bleachers. But 6-year-old Morgan lingered. Sand and small debris had gotten into her sneakers while running through grass and dirt, so she squatted beside the wheel of her mother's parked Nissan to clean them out. She took off her pink sneakers and carefully placed them on the asphalt, concentrating on this simple child's task. At that moment, she was completely alone, separated from the crowd by rows of cars. Colleen Nick, meanwhile, was saying goodbye to friends just a couple dozen steps from where her daughter was. She was distracted for literally 15 or 20 seconds, confident that Morgan was still with her friends. When Colleen looked back toward the parking lot, Ty and the other girl were already approaching her, but the small figure in the green t-shirt was nowhere to be seen. When the mother asked where Morgan was, Ty simply pointed toward the car, explaining that she had stayed there to shake out the sand. Colleen walked briskly to the vehicle, expecting to see her daughter hiding behind the door or squatting down. But the parking lot met her with ringing emptiness. Next to the Nissan's wheel, exactly where the friends had last seen her, stood the pink sneakers. They were set down as if their owner was about to slip them back on in a second, but something or someone had interrupted that action. In those first moments, panic had not yet fully taken hold of Colleen. She began calling Morgan's name, quietly at first, thinking it was a game, but with each passing second, her voice grew higher and more frantic. Soon, her scream, raw with primal fear, drowned out the noise of departing cars and froze everyone at the stadium. Word of the missing child spread instantly. Dozens of people who had been about to go home dropped everything and began searching the area. Police arrived within minutes of the 911 call. Officers immediately gave the case top priority, especially after witnesses mentioned the red truck with the white camper that had sped out of the parking lot at high speed precisely in the moments Colleen discovered the empty shoes. By midnight, the stadium grounds resembled a war zone. K-9 units had arrived, helicopters with thermal imaging circled overhead, and hundreds of volunteers formed human chains, combing every inch of the surrounding woods. Colleen Nick stood at the center of this surreal nightmare, still clutching Morgan's pink sneakers. She was in deep shock, staring into the darkness, hoping to see her daughter's bright head appear. But the stadium floodlights gradually went out, giving way to a cold dawn, and Morgan never came back. By morning, Alma woke up in a new reality, a reality in which safe places no longer existed and something truly sinister had been hiding behind the facade of a quiet American town. Investigators quickly understood the scale of the task, which over time turned into a true technical nightmare. In the mid-1990s, in agricultural states like Arkansas, a red pickup was the most common work vehicle. Thousands of nearly identical trucks traveled the roads. Police launched an unprecedented inspection, eventually checking more than 10,000 trucks nationwide. Officers literally lived in garages and parking lots, measuring gaps between cabs and campers, checking VINs, and interviewing every owner within hundreds of miles. Yet the perpetrator seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to vanish into road dust without leaving a drop of biological material or a single clear fingerprint. Years passed, and the Morgan Nick investigation became an endless series of false hopes and crushing disappointments. One of the most painful moments came in 2002 when police received what they called an extremely specific tip. The information was so detailed that the investigative team had almost no doubts. The burial site had been found. It concerned a remote plot of land in Boonville. For several days, under the gaze of dozens of television cameras, heavy equipment tore open layers of earth, turning an abandoned lot into deep trenches. Colleen Nick stood behind the yellow police tape the entire time, never taking her eyes off the excavator buckets. She waited. Not necessarily for a miracle, but at least for truth. The result of days of digging was only piles of trash and barren soil. That episode left another deep scar on the family's heart, but did not make them give up. Later, the focus shifted to Spiro, Oklahoma. In 2010 and again in 2017, detectives returned to abandoned farms in that area following new witness statements and ground-penetrating radar results. Each time, the scenario repeated with chilling precision: urgent news, excitement among volunteers, and complete silence in the end. But perhaps the cruelest trials for Colleen were the appearances of so-called imposters, people who for various reasons tried to pass themselves off as an adult Morgan. The case of Tanya Smith in 2012 caused a particularly strong resonance. The woman contacted Colleen claiming to be her missing daughter. The resemblance in photographs was striking, and some details of the woman's biography eerily matched the circumstances of the case. Social media and newspapers were already celebrating a miraculous reunion between mother and daughter. Colleen had to go through personal hell waiting for DNA results. torn between insane hope and fear of yet another deception. When the lab ruled out biological relation, it was another world-shattering blow. During these long years when the investigation repeatedly hit dead ends, Colleen found support in her friendship with Patty Wetterling, the mother of another abducted boy, Jacob Wetterling. Patty was the only person who understood Colleen without needing many words. Colleen often asked her how to keep breathing every morning, knowing your child was still out there somewhere in the dark. That solidarity in grief became a lifeline for Morgan's mother. While detectives continued shuffling dusty files, Colleen kept fighting, refusing to let Morgan's case be archived among forgotten stories. She knew the killer was still out there somewhere and believed that time would eventually force him to make a mistake. In the mid-1990s, Morgan Nick's face stopped belonging only to her family. It became the property of the entire nation. After the first weeks of searching yielded no results, Colleen Nick realized that silence was the main enemy. She initiated one of the largest awareness campaigns in the history of missing persons operations. Morgan's image, that little girl with the radiant smile, appeared on millions of milk cartons, billboards, and flyers distributed across the country. This was a continuation of the 1980s tradition when portraits of missing children were printed on milk cartons. For Colleen, it became a heavy psychological ordeal. Every time she went to the store or opened the mailbox, she saw her own daughter turned into a national symbol of tragedy. Morgan became the face of all missing children in Arkansas, which later helped create foundations and alert systems. But for the family, it meant living under the constant gaze of millions of strangers who sympathized but could not help. When conventional investigative methods reached a dead end, the best analysts from Quantico were brought in. FBI profilers studied the circumstances of the abduction at the stadium and created a psychological profile of the suspect that was, in many ways, ahead of its time. They concluded that the abductor was not a random passerby. This was a person who felt completely at home in Alma. Experts described him as a gray man, someone who knows how to be absolutely invisible in a crowd, arousing no suspicion. He possessed enormous patience. He had likely attended similar games more than once, selecting a victim and studying blind spots of cameras and patrols. His choice of Morgan was not random. He was looking for a child who would be left momentarily without direct supervision. The analysts emphasized the perpetrator's cold-bloodedness. To carry out an abduction in front of hundreds of people in just 15 seconds required someone who had pre-calculated every escape route. This profile would later match Billy Jack Lynx perfectly, but in the 1990s the investigation lacked only one thing: physical evidence tying the theory to a specific person. The first serious crack in his disguise appeared just 2 months after Morgan's disappearance, in August 1995. In Van Buren, Lynx attempted to abduct an 8-year-old girl, using an eerily similar scenario. He chose a moment when the child was momentarily out of adult supervision and tried to force her into his vehicle. This time, luck was not on the predator's side. The girl's family was nearby, heard the screams, and fought back fiercely. Lynx was arrested on the spot, and for the first time, police had the opportunity to closely examine both him and his vehicle. Parked in Van Buren was the very vehicle the entire state had been searching for, a bright red Ford pickup with a white camper shell. During a detailed inspection, detectives found the exact features the children from the Alma Stadium had described: a barely noticeable gap between the cab and the camper, and a damaged rear light. It was an incredible match that instantly made Lynx the prime suspect in the Morgan Nick case. Investigators from Alma rushed to interrogate him, hoping the 30-day nightmare for the Nick family was about to end with a confession. But during the 1995 interrogations, Lynx displayed icy calm and astonishing composure. He admitted to the Van Buren abduction attempt, claiming it was a sudden impulse, but categorically denied any involvement in Morgan's disappearance. Detectives spent hours trying to catch him in contradictions, pressing on his past and appealing to his conscience, but Lynx remained impenetrable. In the mid-1990s, DNA analysis technology was not yet capable of working with microscopic or degraded samples, and no direct evidence linking him to the Alma Stadium parking lot was found at that time. Searches of his home and truck yielded no immediate results. Lynx had been careful enough not to leave obvious traces from the first crime. In the end, justice was served only halfway. Billy Jack Lynx was sentenced to a long prison term for the Van Buren incident, but he was never formally charged in the Morgan Nick case. To the investigation, he remained only a person of interest, and to Colleen Nick, the man she was inwardly convinced held the key to her daughter's fate. Years passed. Lynx aged in his cell but never showed any desire to ease his conscience. He kept silent even as his health rapidly deteriorated. Billy Jack Lynx died in prison in September 2000 at the age of 72. News of his death was a devastating blow to the Nick family. The man who had been the only living link to that night at the stadium was gone, leaving behind no note, no confession, no indication of where to look for Morgan. It seemed the mystery of the Sunshine Child's disappearance had been buried forever with him under an unmarked gravestone. But Lynx failed to account for one thing. He left behind the red truck, which sat rotting in an impound lot, and decades later, that vehicle would speak in the language of modern science that a criminal from the past could never have imagined. As investigators delved deeper into Billy Jack Lynx's biography, a terrifying question arose before them. Could a man first decide to commit such a bold child abduction at the age of 67? Professional profilers and experienced FBI investigators unanimously leaned toward the view that the events in Alma and Van Buren were not the beginning, but rather the final act of a long and dark career of a predator. In criminology, there is a firmly held belief that such offenders do not appear out of nowhere in old age. Their deviant behavior usually develops over decades, passing through stages of fantasy and minor offenses before reaching open hunting. Analysts pointed to the frightening confidence with which Lynx acted at the baseball field. He chose the most crowded location possible, calculated the perfect moment when the mother's attention was briefly diverted, and vanished without a trace in just 15 seconds. Such precision and composure are usually the result of years of experience and honed observation skills. Experts began re-examining archives of unsolved cases in Arkansas and neighboring Oklahoma from the 1950s through the 1990s. Lynx had spent almost his entire life in this region, except for his military service during World War II, giving him perfect knowledge of the terrain and decades to remain undetected. Many investigators are convinced that Billy Jack Lynx was a classic serial predator who for decades exploited the image of the quiet neighbor. His inconspicuousness was his main armor. Police checked possible connections between Lynx and other child disappearances that had remained cold cases for decades. Particular attention was paid to cases involving similar vehicle descriptions or the same modus operandi, sudden disappearance of a child from a safe public place. There was suspicion that Lynx may have been involved in at least several more episodes that were at the time attributed to accidents or runaways. The problem was that in the mid-20th century, information sharing between counties was extremely inefficient, and methods for collecting biological evidence were practically non-existent. Lynx, as a veteran and apparently law-abiding citizen, never came to police attention until August 1995. This allowed him to build an impeccable alibi spanning an entire lifetime. Detectives working on the Morgan Nick case repeatedly stated that finding her DNA in Lynx's truck was only the tip of the iceberg. They suspected his dark archive might contain the names of other children whose fates remain unknown. Lynx's death in prison effectively closed the possibility of face-to-face confrontations or obtaining confessions regarding other cases. Yet for many experts in serial murder, his figure remains an example of a successful predator who managed to conceal his true nature behind a mask of ordinariness for nearly 70 years. The thought that Morgan Nick may have been only one of many victims on Billy Jack Lynx's long list remains one of the darkest and most discussed theories in Arkansas crime circles. For nearly 3 decades, the old red truck of Billy Jack Lynx remained a silent monument to the tragedy. It sat in the impound lot, gradually succumbing to the relentless passage of time, metal covered in layers of rust, paint fading under the blazing Arkansas sun, the interior filled with dust and the smell of decay. In forensic science, such objects are often written off, considered irretrievably ruined by decades of environmental exposure. But the investigators working on the Morgan Nick case showed rare persistence. They refused to allow the vehicle to be scrapped, intuitively sensing that this truck still had something to say. The technological breakthrough the Nick family had waited 29 years for came from a field that in the mid-1990s seemed pure science fiction. The Othram Laboratory, specializing in the most complex and hopeless cold cases, was brought in. Specialists at this organization work at the intersection of modern genetics and digital technology, using a method known as forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike standard police DNA tests that require a high-quality sample with a hair root or a large amount of biological material, Othram experts learned to extract information from microscopic and heavily degraded fragments. The key to the solution was a single hair found in Lynx's truck during the original search. In 1995, it was practically useless to investigators because it did not contain enough nuclear DNA for analysis. But in 2024, scientists applied full genome sequencing. This allowed them to literally reconstruct, piece by piece, the genetic profile of the person to whom the hair belonged, despite decades spent in the unfavorable conditions of an impound lot. On October 1, 2024, the silence that had enveloped the Morgan Nick case was finally broken. At an emergency press conference watched live across the state, police and FBI representatives officially announced the results of the analysis. The genetic profile extracted from the hair in Billy Jack Lynx's truck was a complete match with Morgan Nick's DNA. This was not a statistical probability or an assumption. Science gave an unequivocal answer. After 29 years, the investigation finally had direct physical proof that little Morgan had been inside Lynx's red truck on the night of her disappearance. For Colleen Nick, this news became a moment of devastating truth. For 30 years, she had kept a tiny spark of hope in her heart that her daughter was alive and would one day knock on the door. The official laboratory report effectively extinguished that flame, confirming that the Sunshine Child met her end at the hands of a predator. Colleen later described the feeling as reliving that night at the stadium all over again. But now the pain had a name and a face. Science accomplished what thousands of volunteers and hundreds of detectives could not. It irrevocably linked victim and perpetrator with an unbreakable thread of DNA. This breakthrough changed Billy Jack Lynx's status. From a person of interest, he officially became Morgan Nick's abductor. Even though the perpetrator had been dead for more than 20 years, this scientific confirmation carried colossal significance for justice and for the entire child safety system in the United States. It proved that time is no longer absolute protection for criminals. Genetic memory proved stronger than rust and oblivion. Now that the main mystery had been solved, police faced one final and most difficult task: determining exactly where Lynx had left the girl's body. Detectives renewed their efforts to study the movements of the red truck in June 1995, hoping that modern soil analysis and ground-penetrating radar would help them close the case and bring Morgan home for a proper burial. After the 2024 breakthrough, the search for Morgan Nick transformed from simple terrain sweeps into a high-tech operation. Where in 1995 hundreds of volunteers moved blindly, today the investigation uses tools capable of seeing through decades. The main weapon became ground-penetrating radar, GPR. The device sends pulses into the soil, detecting density anomalies. Even after 30 years, the Earth remembers interference. Ground disturbed long ago leaves a permanent shadow on monitors, pointing detectives to places where the natural soil structure was altered by human hands. Using LiDAR and archived satellite imagery, experts reconstructed the Arkansas landscape exactly as it appeared on the night of the abduction. This allowed them to filter out modern terrain changes and pinpoint the red truck's likely routes, narrowing the search zone to specific, previously inaccessible forest areas. Forensic botanists were brought in. Infrared cameras detect microscopic changes in leaf color and tree growth cycles. Nature inadvertently reveals locations where soil was enriched with organic remains. They are complemented by next-generation cadaver dogs whose noses can detect scent even through layers of concrete after 3 decades. Today's search is a battle of science against forgetting. Police are methodically digitizing every meter of land connected to the killer, turning the investigation into precise mathematical calculation. The goal remains the same: to force the Arkansas Earth to return what does not belong to it and finally bring Morgan home. 30 years is an entire lifetime frozen within the walls of Colleen Nick's home. While the world around Alma changed rapidly, Morgan's pink world remained untouched. Her toys and clothes waited for decades for their owner's return. But the tragedy at the baseball field did not remain merely private grief. It was reborn into a massive mission that changed the child safety system across the entire country. Colleen Nick turned her pain into steeled determination. The foundation she established became a support for hundreds of families, and her persistence led to the creation of the Morgan Nick Amber Alert system. Today, Morgan's name is a digital shield that saves thousands of children, giving them the chance that was denied to her in June 1995. For the family, the 2024 breakthrough brought bitter certainty. Genetic testing finally tore the mask from Billy Jack Lynx, proving that the Sunshine Child met her end in his red truck. And though this news extinguished the last spark of hope for a miracle, it opened the path to the final goal: finding the place of rest so Morgan could at last come home. Morgan Nick ceased to be just a name in an archived file. She became a symbol of maternal love that proved stronger than time and oblivion. In the twilight of the Alma Stadium, her presence can still be felt, reminding us that even the deepest darkness is powerless against memory. Morgan forever remained 6 years old, frozen in her last dance with fireflies, but her light continues to live in every rescued child and in every alert signal that will never again allow the truth to disappear.
On September 27, 2024, Arkham Laboratory sent a report to Detective Taylor that the hair contained in the evidence was that of Colleen Nick, one of her siblings, or one of her children. The bottom line in this is that the physical evidence collected from the truck strongly indicates that Morgan had been in this truck. Did Lynx have help in abducting Morgan or concealing his crime all these years? And where is Morgan now? I can tell you today that this investigation is not over.
You know, there have been an army of supporters and advocates and heroes who have rallied to uncover the truth about Morgan's disappearance, and you see those people here in this room today. And what I have to say about Billy Jack Lynx is that he stole Morgan from me. He stole her from her dad. And he stole her from Logan and Taryn. But he didn't see that he could never win. Because our love for Morgan, her memory and her voice outlasted his life. And that love continues to shine. Her heart, Morgan's heart, shines on.
If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. The winter of 2018 in Toronto was a season of bone-chilling revelations. A biting wind swept through the affluent neighborhood of Leaside, rattling the bare branches of dormant trees. On a secluded property on Mallory Crescent, the silence was broken by the heavy rhythmic thud of shovels striking frozen earth. Forensic teams in white suits gathered around large decorative planters, vessels that had once showcased vibrant summer blooms. But as the ice gave way, a horrific harvest was unearthed. Beneath layers of potting soil lay the fragmented remains of men who had disappeared from the city's vibrant village over the span of 8 years. The man responsible was no shadowy monster, but a genial 60-year-old grandfather and sought-after landscaper. Bruce MacArthur hadn't just been tending to the gardens of Toronto's elite, he had been using them as a graveyard. For nearly a decade, he hid his crimes in plain sight, turning beautiful backyards into a meticulously curated house of horrors. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story of Bruce MacArthur is a chilling lesson in the danger of a facade, the way a person can build a life so ordinary that it becomes a perfect camouflage for the unthinkable. To his clients, his friends, and even his family, Bruce was the embodiment of reliability, a man whose life seemed to follow the predictable, slow-moving trajectory of a well-tended garden. He was born in October 1951 and raised in the rural landscape of Argyll, Ontario, a place where traditional values and hard work were the currency of respect. His upbringing was rooted in the strict religious atmosphere of a farm, which perhaps contributed to the rigid emotional walls he would later build around his true self. In his early adulthood, MacArthur played the part of the quintessential family man with practiced precision. He married his wife in the 1970s, and for decades, they raised 2 children in the quiet suburbs of Oshawa. Those who knew him then described a man who was perhaps a bit reserved, but fundamentally nice. He worked as a traveling salesman for a major clothing company, a job that required him to be personable, persuasive, and, above all, forgettable in a crowd. He was the man in the sensible suit, carrying a briefcase, making small talk about the weather and the local sports teams. There was nothing in his demeanor to suggest that beneath the surface, a predatory darkness was slowly taking root. The first major fracture in this carefully constructed mask appeared in the late 1990s. The business of being a traveling salesman was changing, and the financial pressures began to mount, eventually leading MacArthur to declare bankruptcy. But the internal shift was even more profound. After decades of living as a heterosexual husband and father, MacArthur began to explore his identity as a gay man. This transition was not a quiet one. In the early 2000s, he separated from his wife and moved to Toronto, eventually settling in the heart of the city. He didn't just move to a new apartment, he moved into a new life, one that allowed him to finally step into the vibrant, diverse community of the village at Church and Wellesley. It was during this period of reinvention that MacArthur found his second calling: landscaping. He founded a small company called Artistic Design. The name itself was a reflection of how he saw himself, not just a man who cut grass, but a creator of beauty and order. Landscaping was the perfect profession for a man with his specific psychological needs. It allowed him to work alone or with minimal supervision. It gave him a reason to drive a large, nondescript white van through every corner of the city without drawing a second glance. Most importantly, it gave him access to the private spaces of Toronto's elite, the backyards and gated gardens where people felt most secure. To his wealthy clients in neighborhoods like Leaside and Rosedale, Bruce was a gentle giant. He was the silver-haired, slightly portly grandfather figure who arrived with a smile and a trunk full of perennials. He was the kind of contractor you didn't just hire, you trusted. He had the keys to their gates. He knew the layout of their properties, and he knew when they would be away on vacation. He was meticulously organized, keeping detailed logs of his plantings and the materials he used. This same attention to detail, this obsession with order, would later be revealed as the hallmark of his more sinister activities. He was a man who understood that if you bury something deep enough and cover it with something beautiful, people will only see the flowers. By the mid-2000s, MacArthur had become a fixture in the gay community. He was a regular at the local bars, often seen sitting quietly with a drink, observing the younger men. He was known as Santa, or the Grandpa, because of his friendly, non-threatening appearance. He was active on dating apps like Silver Daddies and Scruff, where his profile projected the image of a kind, mature man looking for connection. He would often mention his children and grandchildren, using them as a shield to prove his normality. No one suspected that the man who spoke so warmly about his family was the same man who was meticulously documenting the lives of the men he intended to destroy. The psychological profile that would later emerge was one of a controlled serial killer, a man who did not kill out of sudden, uncontrollable rage, but out of a deeply ingrained, ritualistic need for power. MacArthur was a predator who understood the value of patience. He didn't rush his victims. He cultivated them. He looked for men who occupied the cracks in society, immigrants who were not yet settled, men struggling with addiction, or those whose disappearances might be easily explained away by a lifestyle choice. He was a student of human vulnerability, and he used his grandfatherly persona to lure them into a sense of safety, In the village, he was a ghost, a man who moved through the crowds without leaving an impression. In the gardens of Leaside, he was a craftsman, a man who brought life to the soil. These two identities were kept strictly separate, yet they were inextricably linked. The income from his landscaping business funded his life in the city, while the properties of his clients provided the ultimate concealment for his dark hobby. He was a man living a double life that was so seamless, so perfectly executed, that it lasted for nearly a decade. He was the gardener of death, tending to a hidden harvest that no one, not even the police who patrolled his hunting grounds, dared to believe existed. To understand the tragedy that unfolded between 2010 and 2018, one must first step into the heart of Toronto's Church and Wellesley neighborhood, known simply as The Village. Historically, this enclave served as a sanctuary, a place where those rejected by traditional society could find community, love, and a sense of belonging. The streets are lined with rainbow flags, bustling patios, and historic brick buildings that have witnessed decades of activism and celebration. It is a place of high energy, especially during the summer months when the air is thick with music and the spirit of pride. Yet, like any dense urban center, the village also has its shadows, quiet corners and transient populations that move through the neon lights unnoticed. Bruce MacArthur did not just visit the village, he became a part of its background noise. He was the unassuming older man who could be found at Maggie's or the Black Eagle, often leaning against the bar with a beer in hand, watching the world go through its paces. In a community that often prioritizes youth and beauty, MacArthur was the Silver Daddy, a figure who projected stability and paternal warmth. For many of the men he targeted, this persona was an irresistible draw. He wasn't looking for the spotlight, he was looking for the vulnerable. He was a predator who understood that the best place to hide is in the middle of a crowd. The men who would eventually become names on a police manifest were not chosen at random. MacArthur was a meticulous student of human invisibility. He sought out men who lived on the margins of the community, those who inhabited the cracks, where the light of social safety nets rarely reached. Many of his victims were of Middle Eastern or South Asian descent. Men like Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdulbasir Faizi, and Majid Kaihan. These were individuals navigating the complex intersections of their cultural heritage and their sexual identity. Some were new immigrants, still struggling to find their footing in a foreign land. Others were closeted, living double lives to protect their families or their status in the community. MacArthur knew that if these men went missing, their families might not immediately report it to the authorities, and the authorities in turn might not look very hard for them. This was the core of MacArthur's hunting strategy. He utilized the digital landscape of the 21st century with the same cold precision he used to prune a hedge. He was a frequent user of dating apps like Silver Daddies and Scruff, platforms where he could filter his searches for specific physical types and vulnerabilities. His profiles were masterpieces of normality. He spoke of his love for the outdoors, his career as a landscaper, and his role as a grandfather. He would engage in long, patient conversations, building a rapport and a sense of trust before ever suggesting a meeting. By the time a victim agreed to step into his white work van, they felt they were meeting a friend, not a monster. The van itself was an essential tool in his macabre toolkit. A white 2003 GMC Safari, it was the ultimate urban camouflage. To a passerby, it was just another contractor's vehicle, perhaps filled with mulch, shovels, and flats of begonias. But inside, it was a mobile chamber of horrors. MacArthur had customized the interior, creating a space where he could restrain his victims away from prying eyes. He would lure them to secluded spots or back to his own apartment on Thorncliffe Park Drive, a high-rise building that offered the anonymity of thousands of neighbors living in close proximity. In that apartment, surrounded by the mundane trappings of a quiet life, pictures of his grandchildren, books on gardening, the grandfather of the village would reveal his true face. The psychological warfare MacArthur waged was subtle. He didn't just take lives, he erased them. He took advantage of the transient reputation of the gay community, a stereotype that suggests men often drift in and out of lives, moving away for work or personal reasons without warning. He used this bias to his advantage. When Skandaraj Navaratnam vanished in September 2010, many simply assumed he had moved on. He was a popular figure, a social butterfly, and his sudden absence was felt, but not immediately investigated as a crime. The same pattern followed with Abdulbasir Faizi in late 2010 and Majid Kaihan in 2012. These men didn't just disappear, they were systematically removed from the social fabric of the village by a man who knew exactly how to make a person seem like a ghost. MacArthur's work was not just about the act of killing, it was about the power of the secret. He enjoyed the fact that he was the only one who knew where these men were. He would return to the village day after day, week after week, standing in the same bars where his victims once laughed, perhaps even speaking to their friends. He lived for the thrill of being the wolf in the fold, the gardener who knew that the most beautiful blooms were fed by the darkness beneath the soil. He watched as the community began to whisper about a serial killer, and he watched as the police held press conferences to tell the public there was no evidence of such a thing. The village was more than just a location for MacArthur. It was a resource. He treated the men there like annuals in a garden, things to be admired for a season and then discarded when they no longer served his purpose. He relied on the systemic biases of the time, the idea that a missing immigrant or a closeted gay man was lesser than in the eyes of the law. He bet his life on the fact that the world would look at him and see a harmless old man, and then look at his victims and see people who had simply decided to move away. For 8 long years, that bet paid off. The horror of Bruce MacArthur's reign of terror lay not just in its brutality, but in its chilling consistency. Over the span of 8 years, he established a routine of erasure that turned the vibrant lives of men into mere digital ghosts and physical echoes. He was a man who understood that in a city as large as Toronto, a person doesn't need to be hidden in a remote forest to disappear. They just need to be stripped of their context. MacArthur's method was a slow, agonizing process of cultivation and harvest, where Day X was not a single moment, but a recurring nightmare that the community felt but could not name. The pattern began in earnest on September 6, 2010. Skandaraj Navaratnam, a 40-year-old man known to his friends as Skanda, was a fixture in the village. He was charismatic, a talented dancer, and a man who worked hard as a dishwasher while nurturing deep social ties. He was last seen leaving Zippers, a popular local bar, with an older man. That man was Bruce MacArthur. In the days that followed, Skanda's absence was a deafening silence. He left behind a puppy he adored, a clear sign to those who knew him that he hadn't simply walked away from his life. But to the outside world, he was just another name on a missing persons poster that would eventually be weathered by the rain and forgotten. Only months later, in late December 2010, the pattern repeated. Abdulbasir Faizi, a 44-year-old husband and father who worked as a printer, told his family he was going out with co-workers. He never returned. His car was found abandoned in the Moore Park area, a neighborhood where MacArthur often worked as a landscaper. Then, in October 2012, Majid Kaihan, 58, vanished. Like the others, he had ties to the village but lived a life that was complicated by the expectations of his family and culture. These 3 men formed the initial harvest, men of color, some with precarious social or legal standing, whose disappearances failed to trigger the urgent, citywide alarm that a serial predator was on the loose. MacArthur's Day X for each victim likely followed a grimly similar script. He would lure them to his apartment or a secluded work site under the guise of an intimate encounter. Once they were vulnerable, often restrained as part of a sexual game they believed was consensual, the grandpa persona would evaporate. He used his physical strength and the tools of his trade to overpower them. There were no screams heard through the thin walls of his high-rise apartment. There were no struggles that left behind a mess. He was a professional who knew how to handle materials. He treated the human body with the same cold detachment he applied to a bag of mulch or a length of cedar. After the life had been extinguished, MacArthur began his most macabre ritual, the documentation. He was an obsessive collector of trophies. On his computer, investigators would later find folders meticulously organized by victim name. He would pose the bodies, often dressing them in a fur-lined coat or placing a cigar in their mouths, and take photographs. This was the ultimate expression of his power. He wasn't just a killer. He was a director, a curator of death. He wanted to preserve the moment he turned a living, breathing human being into an object that he owned. These digital files were his secret garden, a place he could revisit whenever he felt the need to reclaim that sense of absolute control. Then came the disposal, a term that feels too sanitary for the reality of his actions. MacArthur would use his landscaping equipment to dismember the remains. This was done with a clinical precision that avoided drawing attention. He didn't dump the remains in a landfill where they might be discovered by a stray dog or a city worker. Instead, he chose the very places where his presence was most expected, the backyards of his clients. At 13 Mallory Crescent, a sprawling property owned by friends who allowed him to store his equipment there, he began a terrifying project. He would place the remains in large, heavy decorative planters, the kind used for ornamental trees or large shrubs. He would layer them with soil, sometimes planting flowers or greenery on top to hide the smell and the sight. He was literally building his graveyard into the landscape of one of Toronto's wealthiest neighborhoods. The brilliance of this plan was its invisibility. Who would ever suspect the friendly, hard-working gardener of carrying human remains in the back of his van? When he arrived at a job site with bags of soil and heavy pots, he was greeted with smiles and offered glasses of water. He was a man doing his job. He would spend hours meticulously tending to the earth, all while the people he worked for sat just a few feet away, oblivious to the fact that their beautiful garden was a tomb. This was MacArthur's greatest triumph, the ability to make his crimes part of the scenery. As the years passed, the Day X events became more frequent, and the victims became more diverse. Soroush Mahmoodi vanished in 2015. Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, an asylum seeker from Sri Lanka who was not even reported missing because he had no family in the city, disappeared in early 2016. Dean Lisowick, a homeless man who frequented the downtown core, was taken in late 2016. Then came Salim Essen in April 2017. With each disappearance, MacArthur's confidence grew. He believed he was untouchable. He had mastered the art of vanishing people in plain sight, and he had learned that as long as he chose his plants carefully, the world wouldn't bother to look beneath the surface. The vanishing patterns were not just about the men who disappeared, but about the silence that followed. MacArthur relied on the fact that these men lived in the periphery. He knew that the police would likely categorize their disappearances as lifestyle choices or voluntary departures. He understood that the media wouldn't obsess over a missing immigrant or a homeless man the way they would a young white student. He was a predator who understood the politics of empathy, and he used that knowledge to ensure that his patterns remained invisible to everyone except the community that was being systematically hunted. By the early 2000s, a heavy, suffocating atmosphere had begun to settle over Toronto's village. It wasn't just the cold winter air or the usual urban grit. It was a growing, gnawing realization that men were vanishing. In a community where everyone knew everyone, or at least recognized the regulars at the bars and cafes, the absences were becoming impossible to ignore. Friends would look for Skandaraj Navaratnam at Zippers and find only an empty stool. They would ask about Abdulbasir Faizi and receive only shrugs. The missing posters began to proliferate, taped to telephone poles and tucked into the windows of shops along Church Street, their edges curling in the wind. This was the beginning of the community's cry, a desperate attempt to force the world to see what the gardener was so carefully burying. The friction between the LGBTQ+ community and the Toronto Police Service, TPS, became a central theme of this period. For years, activists and residents had been sounding the alarm, insisting that a serial predator was hunting in their midst. They pointed to the similarities in the disappearances, men of color, many with ties to the same social circles, vanishing without a trace. But for a long time, these warnings were met with a wall of institutional skepticism. The prevailing narrative from the authorities was often dismissive. They suggested that the men might have simply decided to move away to start new lives, perhaps to escape the pressures of being closeted or to seek better opportunities elsewhere. In their eyes, without a body or a crime scene, there was no proof of a killer. To the community, this felt like a betrayal, a sign that their lives were considered less worthy of a thorough investigation. In response to the mounting pressure, the Toronto police eventually launched Project Houston in November 2012. This task force was specifically designed to investigate the disappearances of Navaratnam, Faizi, and Majid Kayhan. For 18 months, detectives delved into the lives of the missing men. They interviewed hundreds of people, tracked cell phone records, and even looked into Bruce MacArthur. In fact, MacArthur was interviewed by police during this time because he had been linked to some of the men through dating apps and social circles. However, at that point, he was seen as just one of many associates. He played his part perfectly, the helpful, slightly bewildered older man who couldn't imagine what had happened to his friends. Because there was no forensic evidence tying him to a crime, and because he didn't fit the stereotypical profile of a bloodthirsty killer, the police moved on. Project Houston was eventually shuttered in 2014 with no arrests and no clear answers. The police publicly stated that there was no evidence of a serial killer, a statement that landed like a blow to the heart of the village. The closure of the task force sent a chilling message to Bruce MacArthur. He was invisible. He continued his work, both as a landscaper and a predator, with a renewed sense of impunity. While the police retreated, the rumors in the community only intensified. People began to warn each other about the white van and to be careful on dating apps. The fear became a part of daily life, a low-frequency hum of anxiety that influenced where people went and who they talked to. The search for the missing men became a grassroots effort. Friends and family members organized their own search parties, scouring parks and ravines and keeping the names of the vanished alive on social media. They refused to let the vanishing patterns become permanent. They held vigils, lighting candles in the heart of the village, their flickering flames a symbol of defiance against the encroaching darkness. They were fighting not just for their friends, but for their right to be protected by the society they lived in. This was a period of profound social echo, where the failure of the system to act created a deep rift that would take years to heal. The atmosphere in the village during these years was one of calculated silence from the killer and shouted desperation from the residents. MacArthur would often be seen at the very vigils held for his victims, standing at the back of the crowd, his face a mask of solemn concern. He watched the grief he had caused, perhaps even drawing a sick sense of satisfaction from the fact that he was the secret architect of their pain. He was the Santa who brought only sorrow, the grandpa who had stolen their brothers and sons. He was so deeply embedded in the community that he was able to monitor the investigation from the inside, adjusting his behavior to stay one step ahead of the few detectives who were still quietly paying attention. The turning point wouldn't come until several years later, but the foundation for MacArthur's eventual downfall was laid during this time of community activism. The persistence of the village residents ensured that the files on the missing men were never truly cold. They kept the pressure on the police, the media, and the city government. They refused to accept the voluntary departure narrative. They knew their friends, and they knew that men like Skanda wouldn't leave their dogs, and men like Abdulbasir wouldn't abandon their families. Their cry was a demand for justice that eventually became too loud to ignore. As the gardener continued to tend to his hidden harvest in the planters of Mallory Crescent, the world around him was slowly, agonizingly beginning to change. The systemic biases that had protected him were being challenged. The arrival of new technology and more sophisticated digital forensics would eventually provide the tools needed to see through his camouflage. But for now, in the mid-2000s, the village remained a place of mourning and mystery. The community's cry was a lonely sound in a city that wasn't yet ready to hear it, a warning that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who look the most like us. The wall of silence surrounding the disappearances in the village finally began to crumble in late 2017, not because the system had suddenly found its conscience, but because the killer had finally made a mistake in the digital age. On June 26, 2017, Andrew Kinsman, a 49-year-old community activist and former bartender, vanished. Unlike many of MacArthur's previous victims, Kinsman was a man of significant social standing within the village. He had a large network of friends, a steady job, and a reputation for being incredibly reliable. When he didn't show up for work or check in with his neighbors, the alarm was raised almost instantly. This time, the decided-to-move-away narrative wouldn't stick. The community's pressure reached a fever pitch, forcing the Toronto police to launch a new task force, Project Prism. The investigators of Project Prism started with a clean slate, but they were standing on the shoulders of the community's long-ignored observations. They focused heavily on Kinsman's final hours, meticulously piecing together his digital footprint. Andrew was a man of habit. He kept a detailed calendar and was active on dating apps. In his apartment, detectives found a crucial piece of evidence, a single entry in his diary for the day he disappeared. Bruce. It was a simple name, but in the context of a missing person case, it was a lighthouse in the dark. While one team combed through Kinsman's records, another was scanning hundreds of hours of surveillance footage from the area around his home. They were looking for a ghost, a vehicle, or a person that didn't belong. Eventually, they found it. On a grainily recorded feed from a neighbor's security camera, they saw Andrew Kinsman walking toward a white van parked near his residence. He climbed into the passenger side, and the van drove away. The footage wasn't clear enough to read the license plate, but it gave them a make and model, a 2003 GMC Safari. This was the digital trail that MacArthur hadn't accounted for. In the years since his first murders, the city had become blanketed in cameras. Detectives began a painstaking process of cross-referencing every white GMC Safari registered in Ontario with the name Bruce. The search narrowed down to a handful of individuals, but one name jumped off the screen: Bruce MacArthur, the same man who had been interviewed during Project Houston years earlier. The surveillance on MacArthur began in earnest. He was no longer just a background character in the village. He was a high-value target. Undercover officers followed his white van as he moved through the city, watching him tend to gardens, shop for groceries, and visit the same bars where he had hunted for a decade. They watched him with the knowledge that he might be carrying a body at any moment. But they needed more than just suspicion. They needed forensic proof. The breakthrough came when police located the white van. MacArthur had recently sold it to a scrapyard, believing he was clearing his tracks. Forensic teams descended on the vehicle, stripping it down to the frame. Beneath the carpet, in the crevices of the floorboards, they found what they were looking for: microscopic drops of blood. DNA testing confirmed the nightmare. The blood belonged to Andrew Kinsman and Selim Eason, another man who had vanished in early 2017. The harmless gardener was now officially a serial killer in the eyes of the law. But the investigation was far from over. The police knew that if they arrested MacArthur too early, they might never find the other men. They needed to know where the bodies were hidden. They continued the surveillance, watching him as he visited the property at 13 Mallory Crescent. They saw him move heavy planters, his movements practiced and calm. They realized with a jolt of horror that the artistic design company wasn't just a business. It was a mobile disposal service. The tension reached a breaking point on January 18, 2018. Surveillance teams watched as a young man entered MacArthur's apartment on Thorncliffe Park Drive. Fearing that they were about to witness another Day X, the tactical team made the decision to move in. They burst into the apartment and found MacArthur with the young man, who was already restrained on the bed. A black bag was nearby, containing duct tape, a surgical mask, and a syringe. They had arrived just in time to prevent a ninth murder. As MacArthur was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of cold, silent indifference, the forensic teams began the grim task of dismantling his life. In his apartment, they found the digital trophy room, thousands of photographs stored on his computer and in the cloud. These images provided the map of death the investigators needed. They showed the victims in various stages of MacArthur's ritual, and they provided the clues to where the remains might be found. The search of the Mallory Crescent property was one of the most complex forensic excavations in Canadian history. In the middle of a brutal Toronto winter, police had to use heaters to thaw the ground and the soil inside the large planters. One by one, the vessels were emptied, and the fragmented remains of 7 men were recovered. Later, an 8th victim's remains were found in a ravine behind the property. The scale of the horror was unprecedented. The digital trail had led them to a literal field of bones. This part of the investigation was a race against time and the elements. Every shovelful of dirt was sifted, every bone fragment meticulously catalogued. The detectives worked in a state of grim determination, fueled by the realization that they were finally giving names back to the ghosts of the village. They weren't just solving a case, they were answering a decade-long cry for justice. The digital trail hadn't just caught a killer, it had exposed the systemic failures that had allowed him to thrive. It showed that while MacArthur was a master of physical camouflage, he was a novice in a world where every click, every camera, and every diary entry leaves a permanent mark. The investigation into Bruce MacArthur changed the way the Toronto Police Service approached missing persons cases. It forced a reckoning with the biases that had allowed a predator to operate in plain sight for 8 years. It showed that normality can be the most dangerous mask of all. As the evidence mounted, from the blood in the van to the photos on the hard drive to the remains in the planters, the image of the village gardener was replaced by the reality of a cold-blooded, ritualistic serial killer. The harvest was over, but the scars on the community were just beginning to show. The legal proceedings against Bruce MacArthur did not result in a long, drawn-out battle of witnesses. Instead, they delivered a swift, crushing weight of evidence that left no room for doubt. On January 29, 2019, the man who had meticulously cultivated a life of quiet normality stood in a Toronto courtroom and pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. This plea was a final, cold admission of the harvest of horrors he had conducted in the shadows of the village. The courtroom was packed with the families and friends of the victims, men like Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdul Basir Faizi, Majid Kaihan, Soroush Mahmoodi, Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, Dean Lissawick, Selim Essen, and Andrew Kinsman. For many, it was the first time they were seeing the man who had turned their loved ones into names on a forensic manifest. The sentencing hearing revealed the true depth of MacArthur's depravity. The prosecution detailed how he had used the properties of his wealthy clients to dispose of the remains, specifically focusing on the planters at 13 Mallory Crescent. The forensic recovery had been a monumental task, involving the sifting of tons of soil to find thousands of bone fragments. It was a macabre puzzle where the pieces were the literal, shattered lives of his victims. The court heard how MacArthur had kept digital trophies, organized folders of photographs showing the men in the moments after their deaths, often posed in a fur-lined coat that became a haunting signature of his crimes. This wasn't just murder, it was a ritualistic obsession with power and possession. The impact statements from the families were a chorus of shouted desperation and profound grief. They spoke of the years spent in a limbo of uncertainty, wondering if their sons and brothers had abandoned them or if something terrible had happened. The sister of Andrew Kinsman described the black hole his disappearance had left in the community, while the family of Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, an asylum seeker who had fled violence in Sri Lanka only to find a different kind of monster in Canada, spoke through tears about the cruelty of his end. These stories grounded the case in human tragedy, reminding the world that the men in the planters were not just statistics, but individuals with dreams, fears, and people who loved them. In February 2019, Justice John McMahon sentenced Bruce MacArthur to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Because of his age, 67 at the time of sentencing, it was effectively a natural life sentence. The judge described the crimes as pure evil, noting that MacArthur had shown no remorse throughout the process. The resolution of the case brought a sense of grim closure, but it also triggered a massive social echo regarding the systemic failures of the investigation. A subsequent independent review, the Epstein Report, highlighted how missing years of inaction and institutional bias against the LGBTQ+ and immigrant communities had allowed a serial killer to operate for nearly a decade without being caught. The harvest of horrors ended in a prison cell, but the legacy of the case continues to haunt Toronto. It forced a fundamental shift in how missing persons are investigated, moving away from the dismissive, voluntary departure assumptions of the past. For the village, the trial was a moment of collective mourning and a demand that their lives never be treated as invisible again. Bruce MacArthur, The man who thought he could hide a graveyard in a garden would spend the rest of his days as a number in a federal penitentiary, a final, silent end for the gardener of death. The planters at Mallory Crescent have long since been emptied, and the soil that once held such dark secrets has been replaced. But a shadow remains. The case of Bruce MacArthur didn't just end with a life sentence. It left a permanent mark on the psyche of Toronto. The village gardener is gone, but the memory of his betrayal lingers in every manicured yard and every quiet corner of Church and Wellesley. He was a man who proved that the most terrifying monsters don't hide in the woods. They hide in our neighborhoods, offering a friendly smile and a firm handshake while cultivating a harvest of death. For the community, the garden's shadow is a reminder of the calculated silence that nearly cost them everything. It is a testament to the lives of 8 men who were almost erased by a system that looked away. Today, the village is more vigilant, its residents more connected, and the police are more aware that normality is often the ultimate camouflage. The flowers still bloom in the gardens of Leaside, and the sun still shines on the rainbow flags. But the city knows better now. We know that beneath the most beautiful surface, a darkness can take root, and that some gardens are never truly at peace. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. The February air in Green Bay, Wisconsin, carries a jagged edge, the kind of cold that feels personal. But on the morning of February 23rd, 2022, the real freeze was waiting in a basement on the west side of town. Picture the mundane ritual of a mother descending the stairs, perhaps to check on her son or move a load of laundry, only to be met by a silence that feels too heavy, too permanent. She looks toward a plastic laundry basket, expecting the familiar sight of discarded clothes. Instead, she is greeted by the unthinkable, the severed head of her son, Shad Therian. The woman responsible, 24-year-old Taylor Shaughnessy, had already vanished into the pre-dawn shadows by the time the discovery was made. She left behind a subterranean slaughterhouse, a scene of calculated drug-fueled butchery that would leave even veteran investigators shaken. This wasn't merely a crime of passion, it was a quest. A metal chain, a saw, and a collection of plastic buckets were the instruments of an hours-long descent into a psychosis so profound that Taylor would later recount the acts with a detached, surreal curiosity. This is the story of a life discarded in the dark and a mind that had completely severed its connection to the rest of humanity. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. On the other side of this tragedy was Taylor Shaughnessy. At 24 years old, Taylor's life was already a chaotic map of missed opportunities and escalating red flags. To look at her biography is to see a trajectory marked by the devastating impact of severe substance abuse. While she had been married and was a mother herself, the stability of that life had long since dissolved into a cycle of legal run-ins and mental health crises. By early 2022, Taylor was not just a woman struggling with addiction. She was an individual operating in a world where the boundaries of reality were becoming increasingly porous. Taylor's history with the law in the months leading up to the incident provides a chilling prologue. She was already on probation for a previous incident and had a warrant out for her arrest after failing to check into a work release program. Her life had become a series of shadow moves, drifting through the underbelly of Green Bay, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of illicit substances. In the true crime world, we often look for a turning point, but for Taylor, it seemed to be a gradual erosion of empathy and logic, replaced by a dark, self-serving curiosity. The nature of Taylor and Shad's relationship was rooted in this shared world of drug use. They were acquaintances, perhaps friends in the loose sense that the word carries in circles defined by addiction. They were two people drifting through the same social orbit, often coming together to consume drugs, specifically methamphetamine. This substance, known for its ability to strip away sleep and amplify the most erratic impulses of the human brain, acted as the primary catalyst for what was to come. As we look at Taylor's background, we see a woman who was no stranger to the mental health system. However, the system's inability to contain or effectively treat her was evident. There were reports of her acting out, of bizarre behavioral shifts, and a growing detachment from the consequences of her actions. In her own mind, she was becoming the protagonist of a much darker story, one she would later refer to as a quest. This terminology is vital to understanding her mindset. It suggests that she didn't see Shad as a human being with a family and a future, but as an object or a milestone in a twisted internal game. Green Bay, Wisconsin is often characterized by its blue-collar resilience and its tight-knit neighborhoods. It is the last place anyone expected to find a crime that mirrored the most extreme cases of thrill killing or psychotic dismemberment. Yet, beneath the surface of the city's winter calm, Taylor Shaughnessy was spiraling. She was a woman who had lost her anchor to the social contract. When she walked into the Therian household that February, she wasn't just a guest. She was a volatile force of nature, carrying with her the weight of years of untreated trauma, substance-induced psychosis, and a budding, morbid obsession with the mechanics of death. Shad, likely seeing only a familiar face and an opportunity to spend time with a friend, had no way of knowing that the woman entering his home was no longer the Taylor he once knew. The drugs had carved out the person and replaced her with something clinical, something cold. In the days before the basement encounter, Taylor's behavior had become even more erratic. Friends noted a strange intensity in her eyes and a total disregard for the warrants out for her arrest. She was living on borrowed time, and in her warped perception, that made her dangerous. This block of time, the weeks leading up to February 23rd, is the most crucial part of the why. It shows us that this wasn't an isolated explosion of violence. It was the result of two paths converging. One path belonging to a young man who sought connection, and another belonging to a woman who had spent years dismantling her own humanity. Taylor's biography isn't just a list of crimes. It's a warning of what happens when the blood quest becomes more real than the world around you. As the winter sun set over Green Bay, the stage was set for an encounter that would force a mother to look into a laundry basket and see the end of her world, while the woman responsible simply looked on with the eyes of someone who had forgotten how to feel. The backdrop for this descent was the harsh, unforgiving winter of northern Wisconsin. Green Bay in February is a place of biting winds and gray, monochromatic skies, an environment that naturally fosters isolation. For Taylor and Shad, that isolation was weaponized by their shared habit. They weren't just using drugs. They were submerging themselves in a subculture where time ceases to function normally. When you are deep into a binge of methamphetamine and trazodone, the sun rises and sets without meaning. Days bleed into one another. The walls of a room start to pulse with a life of their own, and the person sitting across from you begins to look less like a friend and more like a character in a waking nightmare. Taylor's mental state during this period was a fractured mosaic. Methamphetamine is a stimulant that doesn't just provide a high. It hijacks the brain's survival mechanisms. It induces a state of hypervigilance and, eventually, a profound sense of paranoia and grandiosity. When mixed with trazodone, an antidepressant often used off-label as a sleep aid, the results are unpredictable and often catastrophic. For Taylor, this combination seemed to unlock a door to a latent darkness. She wasn't just hallucinating, she was beginning to inhabit a different internal narrative. This is where the concept of the quest began to take root. In her mind, she was moving through a world governed by different rules, where acts that would be unthinkable to a sober mind became necessary, even adventurous tasks. Witnesses who saw Taylor during this time described a woman who was vibrating with an erratic energy. She was on the run from a world that wanted to put her in a cell, but in her head, she was already far beyond the reach of the law. She would talk in riddles, her eyes darting toward shadows that weren't there. There was a sense of impending action, as if she was waiting for a signal to begin her work. This is the hallmark of substance-induced psychosis. The brain begins to create patterns out of chaos, and for Taylor, those patterns were increasingly violent. Shad Therian, meanwhile, was caught in the gravitational pull of Taylor's chaos. In these types of toxic relationships, there is often a leader and a follower. Taylor was the force of nature, and Shad was the one swept up in her wake. They would spend hours in the basement of the Stony Brook Lane home, a space that served as a refuge from the freezing temperatures and the prying eyes of the world. But a refuge can easily become a trap. The basement, with its concrete floors and lack of natural light, became a sensory deprivation chamber that only amplified the effects of the drugs. As the calendar turned toward the third week of February, the blood quest was no longer a distant thought. It was becoming an obsession. Taylor began to fixate on the idea of control, of testing the limits of the human body. She would later speak about the thrill of the unknown, a clinical curiosity about what happens when the line between life and death is crossed. This is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the spiral, the total dehumanization of her companion. Shad was no longer a person to her. He was a variable in an experiment. The social echo in Green Bay was one of quiet concern that would soon turn into a roar of horror. Neighbors saw the lights flickering in the basement at odd hours. They saw Taylor coming and going, her demeanor becoming more detached and surreal with every visit. But in a community that values privacy, no one stepped in. No one could have imagined that the strange girl visiting the Therian house was actually preparing for a ritual of dismemberment. The psychological depth of this case lies in the total absence of a traditional motive. There was no insurance money, no long-standing grudge, no crime of passion in the romantic sense. There was only the spiral. There was only the chemical erosion of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for empathy and impulse control, until there was nothing left but a raw, predatory instinct. Taylor was a woman who had spent years dismantling her own soul, and by the night of February 22nd, the demolition was complete. Imagine the atmosphere in that basement just hours before the end. The air thick with the metallic scent of drug smoke, the low hum of a space heater, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of two people who had lost all touch with the world above them. The blood quest was about to move from the realm of thought into the realm of physical reality. Taylor was ready. She had the tools, she had the target, and most importantly, she had the absolute chilling certainty that what she was about to do was not just permissible, but destined. This block of the narrative is essential because it strips away the monster archetype and replaces it with something much more grounded and disturbing, a human being who simply stopped being human. The spiral wasn't a jump off a cliff. It was a walk down a long, dark staircase, one step at a time, until the light from the top was nothing more than a pinprick in the distance. As we move toward the events of Day X, we must remember that the tragedy began long before the first drop of blood was spilled. It began when the quest became more important than the man standing in front of her. To truly grasp the gravity of what happened in that Green Bay basement, we have to look closer at the volatile atmosphere that preceded the violence. This wasn't a sudden break from a peaceful life. It was a slow-motion car crash, fueled by a chemical cocktail that had been eroding Taylor Shabusiness's grip on reality for months. In the weeks leading up to February 2022, the spiral was no longer a metaphor. It was a daily, lived experience. The backdrop for this descent was the harsh, unforgiving winter of northern Wisconsin. Green Bay in February is a place of biting winds and gray, monochromatic skies, an environment that naturally fosters isolation. For Taylor and Shad, that isolation was weaponized by their shared habit. They weren't just using drugs, they were submerging themselves in a subculture where time ceases to function normally. When you are deep into a binge of methamphetamine and trazodone, the sun rises and sets without meaning. Days bleed into one another. The walls of a room start to pulse with a life of their own, and the person sitting across from you begins to look less like a friend and more like a character in a waking nightmare. Taylor's mental state during this period was a fractured mosaic. Methamphetamine is a stimulant that doesn't just provide a high, it hijacks the brain's survival mechanisms. It induces a state of hypervigilance and, eventually, a profound sense of paranoia and grandiosity. When mixed with trazodone, an antidepressant often used off-label as a sleep aid, the results are unpredictable and often catastrophic. For Taylor, this combination seemed to unlock a door to a latent darkness. She wasn't just hallucinating. She was beginning to inhabit a different internal narrative. This is where the concept of the quest began to take root. In her mind, she was moving through a world governed by different rules, where acts that would be unthinkable to a sober mind became necessary, even adventurous tasks. Witnesses who saw Taylor during this time described a woman who was vibrating with an erratic energy. She was on the run from a world that wanted to put her in a cell, but in her head, she was already far beyond the reach of the law. She would talk in riddles, her eyes darting toward shadows that weren't there. There was a sense of impending action, as if she was waiting for a signal to begin her work. This is the hallmark of substance-induced psychosis. The brain begins to create patterns out of chaos, and for Taylor, those patterns were increasingly violent. Shaughnessy, meanwhile, was caught in the gravitational pull of Taylor's chaos. In these types of toxic relationships, there is often a leader and a follower. Taylor was the force of nature, and Shad was the one swept up in her wake. They would spend hours in the basement of the Stony Brook Lane home, a space that served as a refuge from the freezing temperatures and the prying eyes of the world. But a refuge can easily become a trap. The basement, with its concrete floors and lack of natural light, became a sensory deprivation chamber that only amplified the effects of the drugs. As the calendar turned toward the third week of February, the blood quest was no longer a distant thought. It was becoming an obsession. Taylor began to fixate on the idea of control, of testing the limits of the human body. She would later speak about the thrill of the unknown, a clinical curiosity about what happens when the line between life and death is crossed. This is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the spiral, the total dehumanization of her companion. Shad was no longer a person to her. He was a variable in an experiment. The social echo in Green Bay was one of quiet concern that would soon turn into a roar of horror. Neighbors saw the lights flickering in the basement at odd hours. They saw Taylor coming and going, her demeanor becoming more detached and surreal with every visit. But in a community that values privacy, no one stepped in. No one could have imagined that the strange girl visiting the Therian house was actually preparing for a ritual of dismemberment. The psychological depth of this case lies in the total absence of a traditional motive. There was no insurance money, no long-standing grudge, no crime of passion in the romantic sense. There was only the spiral. There was only the chemical erosion of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for empathy and impulse control, until there was nothing left but a raw, predatory instinct. Taylor was a woman who had spent years dismantling her own soul, and by the night of February 22nd, the demolition was complete. Imagine the atmosphere in that basement just hours before the end. The air thick with the metallic scent of drug smoke, the low hum of a space heater, and the heavy rhythmic breathing of two people who had lost all touch with the world above them. The blood quest was about to move from the realm of thought into the realm of physical reality. Taylor was ready. She had the tools, she had the target, and most importantly, she had the absolute chilling certainty that what she was about to do was not just permissible, but destined. This block of the narrative is essential because it strips away the monster archetype and replaces it with something much more grounded and disturbing, a human being who simply stopped being human. The spiral wasn't a jump off a cliff. It was a walk down a long, dark staircase, one step at a time, until the light from the top was nothing more than a pinprick in the distance. As we move toward the events of Day X, we must remember that the tragedy began long before the first drop of blood was spilled. It began when the quest became more important than the man standing in front of her. The date was February 22nd, 2022, a Tuesday that for the rest of the world was just another cold weekday in late winter. But for Taylor Shaughnessy and Shad Therian, it was the climax of a toxic trajectory that had been building for months. The setting was the basement of Shad's mother's house on Stony Brook Lane in Green Bay, a space that would soon be scrubbed of its normalcy and rebranded in the public consciousness as a house of horrors. To understand the incident, we must step into that subterranean space, feeling the chill of the concrete and the heavy, stagnant air of a room where the light of day never reaches. Taylor arrived at the house with the focus of someone on a mission. There was no grand entrance, no outward sign of the carnage she carried in her mind. She and Shad descended the stairs, a routine they had performed many times before. The basement was Shad's sanctuary, a place filled with the familiar clutter of a young man's life, video games, clothes, and the remnants of a shared habit. But that night, the drugs took center stage. They consumed methamphetamine and trazodone, a combination that doesn't just alter the mood, it dismantles the architecture of the self. As the chemicals flooded their systems, the basement ceased to be a room in a family home. It became a vacuum, a void where the social contract was null and void. The evening began with what Taylor would later describe as a consensual sexual encounter, but it was one underscored by a disturbing element of play that quickly spiraled into something lethal. Taylor had brought a metal chain with her, a heavy industrial object that felt cold and uncompromising against the skin. In her later confessions, she spoke of the use of the chain as if it were a game, a way to test the limits of sensation. But there is a point in every game of this nature where the line between pleasure and pain vanishes, replaced by a raw existential struggle for breath. As they engaged, the chain was placed around Shad's neck. In a sober world, there are safeguards, words, and gestures that signify a return to safety. But in the drug haze of that basement, Taylor was no longer listening to the world around her. She was listening to the quest. She began to tighten the chain. We often think of violence as a loud, explosive event, but strangulation is a quiet, intimate, and agonizingly slow process. It requires a sustained, terrifying level of physical effort. It requires the perpetrator to watch, inches away, as the life fades from their companion's eyes. Taylor didn't stop. She didn't pull back when Shad began to struggle, nor did she falter when his movements grew frantic and then, eventually, subsided into a harrowing stillness. She would later tell investigators that she didn't mean to kill him, that they were just having fun. But the physical reality of the act tells a different story. To strangle someone with a chain requires a deliberate, unyielding force. It is the ultimate expression of control. For Taylor, as she felt the pulse beneath the metal grow faint and then vanish, the quest had reached its first major milestone. Shad Therian was no longer a person. He was a body. The moments immediately following Shad's death are perhaps the most telling of Taylor's psychological state. There was no scream of realization, no panicked call for help, no frantic attempt at CPR. Instead, there was a heavy, suffocating silence. Taylor sat in the dim light of the basement, looking at the man she had just killed. In her mind, the transition was seamless. The sexual encounter had ended, and the work was about to begin. She wasn't horrified by what she had done. She was intrigued. She viewed the lifeless body before her with a clinical, almost artistic detachment. To her, this wasn't a tragedy. It was a new phase of the experiment. She spent a significant amount of time just sitting with the body, a period of transition that bridges the gap between a homicide and a dismemberment. This is the moment where the human mind usually breaks, where the reality of taking a life becomes an unbearable weight. But Taylor's mind had already broken long ago. The drugs had provided a buffer of psychosis that allowed her to look at Shad's corpse and see only a project. She began to gather her tools. She didn't have to look far. The basement was a place of utility, and soon, ordinary household items, knives, a saw, would be repurposed for a task so grisly it defies standard criminal categorization. The incident on Stony Brook Lane wasn't just the act of killing, it was the total and systematic erasure of a human being's dignity. As Taylor began the first cuts, she was operating in a state of flow. She wasn't rushed. She wasn't afraid of being caught, even though Shad's mother was just a floor above her, sleeping in a world where such things didn't happen. The audacity of the crime lies in its proximity to normalcy. While the neighborhood remained quiet under the winter stars, a young woman was meticulously dismantling a human body in a laundry room. This was the blood quest in its purest form, a descent into the macabre where the perpetrator becomes a spectator to their own depravity. Taylor would later describe the sensations of the night with a chilling lack of affect, noting the difficulty of certain tasks and the satisfaction of completing others. She treated the dismemberment not as a way to hide a crime, but as a continuation of the night's adventure. Each part of the process was a new discovery, a new way to interact with the shell of the person she had once called an acquaintance. As the hours ticked toward dawn, the basement became a surreal gallery of the unthinkable. Plastic buckets were filled. A laundry basket was repurposed for the most haunting cargo imaginable. Taylor worked through the night, her energy sustained by the methamphetamine and the dark adrenaline of her work. She was a ghost in a house of the living, a predator who had finished the hunt and was now occupied with the spoils. When we look back at Day X, we are forced to confront the limitlessness of human darkness when it is unmoored from reality. There were no monsters under the bed that night, only a 24-year-old woman with a chain and a saw, and a 25-year-old man who had the misfortune of being the subject of her quest. The transition from life to death, and from death to pieces, happened in the time it takes for the sun to move across the sky. By the time the first light of February 23rd began to touch the frost on the basement windows, the incident was over, and the nightmare for the Therian family was just beginning. Taylor Shaughnessy walked out of that basement, leaving behind a scene that would forever change the landscape of Green Bay, carrying with her the blood of a quest that had finally, tragically, been fulfilled. The hours following Shad Therian's final breath were not marked by a sudden return to reality for Taylor Shaughnessy. Instead, the death of her companion served as the opening act for a long, macabre performance. If the strangulation was the peak of the incident, what followed was the work, a systematic, hours-long process of dismemberment that Taylor approached with a level of detachment that borders on the incomprehensible. As the rest of Green Bay slept, unaware of the carnage unfolding on Stony Brook Lane, Taylor transformed a family basement into a theater of the grotesque. There is a specific kind of horror in the endurance required for dismemberment. It is not a quick task. It is a grueling physical labor that requires hours of focus. Taylor didn't panic. She didn't look for a way to flee. Instead, she stayed with the body, treating it as a project. She began by using bread knives and a saw, tools that were never intended for the density of human bone and sinew. In her later interviews, she spoke about the process with a chillingly practical tone, noting which tools worked and which did not, as if she were a hobbyist discussing a home renovation project. She wasn't just hiding a body, she was exploring it. The blood quest she frequently referenced seemed to manifest in this stage of the night. To Taylor, every cut was a discovery. She spent a significant portion of the early morning hours meticulously separating Shad's limbs and organs. This was not the work of someone trying to dispose of evidence in a hurry. A person trying to hide a crime would likely move the body whole or dump it in a remote location. Taylor, however, stayed. She stayed in the same house where Shad's mother and her boyfriend were sleeping just floors above. The audacity of this, the sheer cold-blooded patience required to remain in a crime scene for hours, points to a mind that had completely severed its connection to the concepts of risk and consequence. As she worked, the basement took on the appearance of a butcher shop. She placed parts of Shad's body into plastic buckets and bags. This was an organized effort, a bizarre attempt at cleaning up as she went. The most haunting image of that night, the one that would eventually break his mother's heart, was the placement of Shad's head into a laundry basket. There is something uniquely predatory about that choice, taking the most recognizable part of a human being and placing it in an object associated with the mundane chores of daily life. It was a final, crushing blow to Shad's humanity. Taylor's movements during these hours were described by her as frenzied yet focused. The drugs, the methamphetamine and trazodone, likely acted as both the fuel for her energy and the wall that kept the horror of the situation at bay. In a state of drug-induced psychosis, the brain can focus on small, repetitive tasks with an obsessive intensity. For Taylor, the task was the disassembly of Shad Therian. She would later remark to investigators that she liked the process, or that it provided a sense of adventure. This wasn't a woman struggling with a mistake. It was a woman who had finally found the quest she had been searching for. Throughout the night, the environment in the basement shifted. The metallic scent of blood would have become heavy, mixing with the chemical odors of the drugs they had consumed. The low light and the cramped space of the laundry area created a claustrophobic stage for her actions. Yet, Taylor seemed at home in it. She worked until the sun began to rise, eventually deciding that it was time to leave. But even her departure was surreal. She didn't take all the remains with her. She left the laundry basket. She left the buckets. She left the head of her friend for his mother to find. She did, however, take some souvenirs with her. When she finally walked out of the house and got into her van, she brought a crock pot and additional buckets containing Shad's internal organs. This detail is perhaps the most disturbing of all. It suggests that the quest wasn't over when she left the basement. She wanted to keep a part of the experience with her, to continue her interaction with the remains in a different setting. As she drove through the early morning streets of Green Bay, Taylor Shaughnessy wasn't a fugitive in her own mind. She was a collector. The long night on Stony Brook Lane stands as a testament to the devastating intersection of severe substance abuse and a latent, predatory darkness. It challenges our understanding of human behavior because there is no logical end goal to Taylor's actions. She didn't gain anything from the dismemberment. She didn't make her escape easier. In fact, she made her capture inevitable. She stayed because she wanted to be there. She performed the work because it satisfied a dark internal itch that the drugs had laid bare. By the time she reached her vehicle and began to drive away, Taylor was covered in the evidence of her night's labor. She was a woman who had just spent 6 to 8 hours dismantling a human being. Yet when police eventually caught up with her, she appeared strangely calm. The long night had ended, and the blood quest had reached its grisly conclusion. Behind her, in a quiet basement in a quiet neighborhood, the remains of Shad Therian waited in the dark, a silent, shattered reminder of the night Taylor Shaughnessy decided to see what was inside the man she had just killed. The impact of this specific block of time cannot be overstated. In the world of true crime, we often focus on the who and the why, but the how of this dismemberment provides the clearest window into Taylor's soul. It shows a level of depravity that is not just impulsive, but sustained. It was a choice she made every minute for 8 hours. Every time she picked up the saw, every time she moved a limb, she was choosing to continue her descent. When the sun finally rose over Green Bay on February 23rd, it didn't just reveal a crime, it revealed a monster that had been built 1 hour at a time in the shadows of a laundry room. The morning of February 23, 2022, arrived with a deceptively normal sunrise over Green Bay. While the city stirred to life, the house on Stony Brook Lane remained a silent tomb, hiding a reality that was about to shatter the lives of everyone associated with it. For Shad Therian's mother, Tara Pakinich, the day began with the heavy, intuitive dread that something was wrong. She had heard the muffled sounds from the basement during the night, but in a household where late hours and strange visitors were not uncommon, she had tried to maintain the boundary of her son's privacy. However, as the morning progressed and the silence from downstairs became too absolute, that boundary finally collapsed. The discovery is a moment that transcends the standard narrative of a crime. It is the point where the mundane world of laundry and home life collides with a level of depravity that the human brain is not wired to process. Tara descended the stairs, perhaps expecting to find her son asleep or perhaps hoping to clear away the remnants of a long night. Instead, she walked into a scene that would haunt the collective consciousness of the state. There, in a simple plastic laundry basket, lay the severed head of her child. The physical shock of such a discovery often induces a kind of sensory overload. There are no words for the scream that follows a realization of that magnitude. Tara and her boyfriend fled the house, their reality having been permanently altered in the span of a single heartbeat. When the 911 call reached the Green Bay Police Department, the dispatcher heard a level of hysteria that signaled this was not a standard domestic disturbance. It was a report of the unthinkable. When officers arrived at the Stony Brook Lane residence, they entered a subterranean world that felt like a nightmare made flesh. The basement was a labyrinth of buckets and bags, each containing a piece of the young man who had been alive just 24 hours prior. The cold-blooded organization of the scene was what struck the investigators most. This wasn't a crime of passion left in a messy heap. It was a work that had been completed and then abandoned. The metal chain, the instrument of Shad's final moments, was still there, a silent witness to the quest Taylor had so frequently mentioned. While the police were processing the horror of the basement, the search for the capture began. Taylor Shaughnessy hadn't exactly been subtle. She had left the scene in her own vehicle, and her history with the local authorities made her an immediate and obvious person of interest. Within hours, police tracked her to an apartment complex on the other side of town. The encounter that followed was as surreal as the crime itself. When officers approached Taylor's van, they didn't find a woman in the throes of a breakdown. They found a woman who appeared to be in a state of eerie, drug-induced tranquility. Her clothes were stained with the evidence of her night's labor, yet she spoke to the officers with a detached, almost conversational tone. It was as if she were being questioned about a minor traffic violation rather than a sadistic dismemberment. As they took her into custody, the true extent of her souvenirs was revealed. Inside the vehicle, investigators found a crockpot and several more buckets. When they opened them, they found Shad's internal organs. The capture of Taylor Shaughnessy was not the end of a hunt, but the beginning of a long, disturbing interrogation. During her initial interviews, Taylor didn't deny what she had done. In fact, she seemed almost eager to recount the details, describing the fun she had and the satisfaction of the dismemberment. She spoke about the quest with a sincerity that suggested she truly believed she had achieved something significant. She told the detectives that they were going to have a busy day trying to find all the pieces, a comment that revealed a total lack of empathy or remorse. The visual of Taylor in the back of a squad car, calm, smeared with blood, and looking out at the world through the haze of methamphetamine, became the defining image of the case. She was a woman who had crossed a line that most people don't even know exists. For the Green Bay community, the capture brought a cold kind of relief, but it couldn't erase the image of the laundry basket. The discovery had turned a mother into a victim of a secondary trauma that would last a lifetime, while the capture revealed a perpetrator who seemed to have forgotten how to be a victim of her own conscience. As Taylor was led into the jail, the social echo in Green Bay began to grow. This wasn't just another drug case. It was a glimpse into a level of psychopathy that felt predatory and alien. People began to question the systems that had allowed a woman like Taylor to remain on the streets with active warrants and a history of instability. But mostly, they thought of Shad. They thought of the gentle young man who had invited a friend into his home, only to be turned into a project for her twisted amusement. The capture was a legal victory, but in the face of such absolute darkness, it felt like a very small light. This block of the story serves as the bridge between the visceral horror of the basement and the clinical reality of the legal system. It shows the immediate, devastating ripple effect of Taylor's actions, how a single night of questing destroyed a family and left a city searching for answers that might not exist. The transition from the long night to the capture was a movement from a private nightmare to a public tragedy, and as Taylor sat in her cell, the world was finally forced to look at the face of the woman who had brought the blood quest to Green Bay. The trial itself was punctuated by moments of shocking aggression. In a scene that went viral and stunned the courtroom, Taylor physically attacked her own defense attorney, Quinn Jolly, during a hearing regarding the competency of an expert witness. The sight of a defendant lunging at her legal counsel served as a visceral reminder of the danger she posed. It reinforced the image of a woman who had completely discarded social boundaries, treating the courtroom with the same lack of empathy she had shown Shad Therian in that basement. Despite her outbursts, the jury was tasked with looking past the spectacle to the evidence of the crime itself. They were presented with the harrowing details of the strangulation and the methodical dismemberment. The prosecution highlighted the fact that Taylor had stayed with the body for hours, making conscious choices at every step of the work. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, it was a marathon of depravity. The clinical nature of the dismemberment, the use of household tools, and the organized placement of remains spoke to a level of focus that contradicted the idea of a total psychotic break. In July 2023, the jury reached a verdict. Taylor Shaughnessy was found guilty on all counts: first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and third-degree sexual assault. The second phase of the trial, which focused on her sanity, also went against her. The jury determined that while she may have been under the influence of drugs, She was legally sane at the time of the killing. She knew exactly what she was doing. At her sentencing in September 2023, the judge, Thomas Walsh, did not mince words. He described the case as the most disturbing he had seen in his career, noting the profound lack of remorse Taylor had displayed from the moment of her arrest. He sentenced her to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. For the Therian family, the sentence offered a finality to the legal battle, but the emotional resolution remained elusive. Shad was gone, and the image of that laundry basket remained etched into their lives. Taylor was led away, destined to spend the rest of her days behind bars, a woman who had sacrificed everything for a quest that ended in a cell. The trial was over, but the shadow she cast over Green Bay would remain for years to come. The case of Taylor Schabusiness and Shad Therian remains a jagged scar on the collective memory of Green Bay, serving as a visceral reminder of how quickly untreated addiction can erode the foundations of human empathy. While the legal system has reached its resolution, condemning Taylor to a life within the sterile walls of a prison cell, the true blood quest ended in a tragedy that no sentence can fully rectify. Shad's life, once full of gentle potential and familial love, was reduced to a clinical project by a mind consumed by substance-induced psychosis. This story is not just a chronicle of a horrific crime. It is an exploration of the absolute darkness that exists when a person ceases to view others as human beings. As the community moves forward, the silence of that basement on Stony Brook Lane serves as a somber monument to a lost son and a warning of the internal poison that can corrode the soul until only shadows remain. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. January 16th, 2026. The sweltering morning air in Aguascalientes, Mexico, doesn't feel like the end of the world. It feels like a heavy, humid silence. For nearly 10 years, a man moved through these dusty streets like a shadow, a ghost, with 1,000 faces and no name. He was a whisper in the deep files of the FBI, a face on a 10 Most Wanted poster that had begun to yellow and curl at the edges. Back in 2016, in the quiet, wooded outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina, a young woman's light was extinguished over a few $100s, a petty debt that became a cold-blooded death warrant. The man responsible didn't just run, he vanished into the jagged, lawless landscape of a completely different life. But justice has a long memory and a very cold heart. As the steel handcuffs finally clicked shut in the gray light of dawn, the decade-long game of cat and mouse reached its final move. The fugitive was no longer a ghost. He was Alejandro Rosales Castillo, and the bill for 2016 had finally come due. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Charlotte, North Carolina, is often described as a city of shimmering glass towers and quiet, oak-lined neighborhoods, a place where the American dream feels within reach for those willing to put in the hours. In the mid-2000s, this was the backdrop for the lives of Alejandro Rosales Castillo and Sandy Lay. To those who crossed their paths at a local Showmars restaurant where they both worked, they seemed like typical young adults navigating the early chapters of their independence. Alejandro, born in Arizona, but raised largely in the Charlotte area, was 20 years old in 2016. He was known to colleagues as a capable worker, though those who looked closer saw a young man who lived on the edge of his means, someone who craved a status his paycheck couldn't quite provide. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that bordered on arrogance, a trait that would later be reevaluated by investigators as the hallmark of a burgeoning sociopath. Sandy Lee, just 23, was a stark contrast in spirit. She was a woman defined by her kindness and a relentless work ethic. Her family described her as a pillar of support, someone who moved through life with a gentle grace but possessed a sharp mind for detail. She wasn't just working a job, she was building a future. Sandy was known for her generosity, often being the one to step in when a friend was in a financial bind. It was this very quality, her willingness to trust and her desire to help, that would ultimately place her in the crosshairs of a predator. The social circle at the restaurant was tight-knit, a common phenomenon in the service industry where long hours and shared stress forge quick bonds. Within this circle was another figure who would play a pivotal role in the coming tragedy, Amariba Feaster. Amariba, or Abby as she was known, was 19 and deeply entwined with Alejandro. Their relationship was volatile, fueled by a mutual desire for a lifestyle they couldn't afford and a shared sense of entitlement that frequently led them into murky waters. To the outside world, they were just another young couple, but behind closed doors, a darker dynamic was simmering. Alejandro was the dominant force, a manipulator who used Abby's devotion to anchor his own erratic impulses. The tension began not with a grand betrayal, but with something far more mundane, a debt. Alejandro had borrowed money from Sandy, a sum estimated to be around $1,000. In the grand scheme of a city like Charlotte, it was a pittance, but in the world of young adults living paycheck to paycheck, it was a significant weight. For Sandy, the money represented her hard-earned savings. For Alejandro, it was a constant reminder of a power dynamic he couldn't tolerate. He didn't see the loan as an act of kindness. He saw it as an obligation that shackled him to someone he considered an obstacle. As the summer of 2016 reached its peak, the atmosphere within the group began to shift. Alejandro's resentment wasn't hidden. It was a cold, creeping thing. He began to whisper to Abby about solutions to their financial problems, framing Sandy not as a friend, but as a creditor who was pressuring them. It was a classic manipulation tactic, dehumanizing the victim to justify the crime that was already taking shape in his mind. He wasn't just looking for a way to avoid paying her back. He was looking for a way to erase the debt and the person attached to it. Sandy, meanwhile, remained unaware of the darkness brewing. She continued to show up for her shifts, her wide smile a fixture of the restaurant. She believed in the best of people, trusting that the loan would be repaid when Alejandro got back on his feet. She didn't realize that every time she checked in on the status of the money, she was inadvertently tightening the noose Alejandro was preparing for her. The biography of Alejandro Castillo is not one of a man driven to madness by sudden tragedy, but of a man who systematically chose the path of least resistance, even when that path required the ultimate sacrifice from someone else. His history in the Charlotte area showed glimpses of this: minor brushes with the law, a tendency to vanish when things got difficult, and a pattern of using women to facilitate his lifestyle. By August 2016, he had reached a breaking point. He was broke, he was angry, and he had a partner in Abby who was willing to follow him into the abyss. The stage was set in the humid North Carolina woods, away from the glass towers and the bustling streets, where the veneer of regular guy Alejandro would finally drop, revealing the fugitive who would haunt the FBI for the next 10 years. Sandy Lay wasn't just a victim of a robbery, she was the victim of a man who decided his pride was worth more than her life. This was the environment of 2016, a mix of petty grievances and cold calculation that was about to explode into a headline that wouldn't find its period for a decade. The social ecosystem of a bustling restaurant like Shomar's often functions as a pressure cooker of personalities. Long hours spent in cramped quarters, the frantic rhythm of the lunch rush, and the shared exhaustion of the closing shift. For Sandy Lee, the restaurant was more than just a place of employment. It was a community. She was the kind of person who anchored that community, offering a stabilizing presence to the younger, more volatile employees. Among those younger co-workers were Alejandro Castillo and Amariba Abby Feaster. At first glance, the relationship between these three seemed built on the easy camaraderie of co-workers who had seen each other at their most stressed. They shared meals, traded stories about difficult customers, and eventually, the professional boundary blurred into a personal one. Sandy, with her natural inclination toward mentorship and support, took Alejandro under her wing. She saw a 20-year-old trying to find his footing, and when he spoke of financial struggles, she didn't hesitate to offer a solution. The loan was supposed to be a bridge, a temporary fix for a young man who couldn't quite make his ends meet. To Sandy, the $1,000 she handed over was a gesture of faith in a friend. She expected that, in time, Alejandro would honor that trust. However, the moment the money changed hands, the invisible architecture of their relationship shifted. Alejandro didn't feel gratitude. He felt the suffocating weight of an obligation he had no intention of fulfilling. In his mind, Sandy was no longer a friend or a co-worker. She was a predator, a constant reminder of his own perceived inadequacy and his lack of control. He began to view her check-ins regarding the money as acts of aggression, twisting her patience into a form of harassment. While Alejandro's resentment was festering, his relationship with Abby Feaster was becoming an echo chamber for his darkest impulses. Abby was deeply infatuated with Alejandro, drawn to his confidence and the sense of excitement he brought into her world. She was young, impressionable, and increasingly isolated from outside influences that might have tempered Alejandro's manipulation. Within the privacy of their relationship, Alejandro began to frame Sandy as a villain. He painted a picture of a woman who was pressuring them, who was making their lives difficult over a sum of money he felt he didn't truly owe. He used Abby's loyalty as a weapon, convincing her that Sandy's existence was a threat to their shared future. It was a masterful bit of psychological theater. He wasn't asking Abby to help him commit a crime, he was asking her to help him solve a problem that was hurting them both. As the summer of 2016 progressed, the three of them continued to inhabit the same physical spaces, but the psychological distance was growing vast. Sandy remained the same, steadfast, kind, and professional, unaware that she was being discussed in whispers during Alejandro and Abby's late-night conversations. To the other employees at Showmars, nothing seemed amiss. They saw a group of friends who occasionally hung out outside of work. They didn't see the way Alejandro's eyes darkened when Sandy entered a room, or the way Abby began to mirror his coldness. The relationship had become a parasitic one, with Alejandro feeding on Abby's devotion to fuel a plan that was becoming increasingly concrete. Alejandro's manipulation of Abby was systematic. He didn't just tell her Sandy was a problem. He made Abby feel responsible for the solution. He tapped into her fears of losing him, suggesting that if they didn't get out from under this debt, they wouldn't be able to stay together. He began to talk about leaving Charlotte, about starting over somewhere else, perhaps Mexico, where he had family connections. But to do that, they needed money, and they needed to erase the obstacles holding them back. The problem of Sandy Love became the focal point of their shared reality. Alejandro convinced Abby that they were the victims in this scenario, and that any action they took was merely a form of self-defense against a world that was trying to keep them down. The dynamic between the two of them was a classic folie à deux, a shared delusion where the paranoia of one partner is adopted by the other. Alejandro provided the direction, and Abby provided the validation. They began to plan their exit strategy, and central to that plan was the final meeting with Sandy. Alejandro knew Sandy's routine. He knew her kindness would make her an easy target. He didn't need to force her into a trap. He only needed to invite her. He crafted a story about finally having the money to pay her back, a lie designed to appeal to her sense of relief and her desire to put the financial tension behind them. In the final weeks leading up to August, the trio's interactions were a masterclass in deception. Sandy, feeling that the end of the debt was in sight, was likely lighter, more at ease. She probably felt a sense of pride that her help had finally served its purpose. Alejandro and Abby, meanwhile, were operating in a state of hypervigilance, their every word and gesture calculated to maintain the facade of normalcy. They were no longer co-workers. They were actors in a play where the final act had already been written in blood. The meeting they were arranging wasn't a transaction, it was a transition. The moment Alejandro would move from being a debt-ridden restaurant worker to a cold-blooded killer on the run. The tragedy of Sandy Lou's relationship with Alejandro was that she never saw the predator behind the friend. She judged him by her own standards of loyalty and honesty, failing to realize that he operated by a completely different set of rules. While she was planning her future in Charlotte, Alejandro was planning her erasure. The debt, which to her was a simple matter of math and friendship, had become to him a matter of life and death. This block of time, the months spent in the daily grind of the restaurant, was the gestation period for a monster. It was here, amidst the smell of fried food and the clatter of dishes, that the decision was made. The relationship that had begun with a handshake and a loan would end in a desolate patch of woods, proving that sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones we shouldn't have trusted at all. The complexity of this dynamic is what makes the case so haunting. It wasn't a crime of passion, but a crime of convenience and ego. Alejandro didn't kill Sandy because he hated her in the traditional sense. He killed her because she was in his way. He killed her because he could, and because he had spent months convincing himself and his partner that it was the only logical choice. As the calendar turned to August 2016, the time for talking was over. The debt was about to be settled, but not in the way Sandy Le had ever imagined. The trap was set, the weapon was ready, and the two people she called friends were waiting for her in the shadows. The heat of a North Carolina August is a heavy, suffocating thing, a damp blanket of humidity that clings to everything and makes the air feel thick enough to taste. On Tuesday, August 9th, 2016, this oppressive atmosphere served as the backdrop for what was supposed to be a simple, long-awaited meeting. Sandy Lowe had every reason to believe that the day would mark the end of a frustrating chapter. After months of patience, Alejandro Castillo had finally reached out with the news she wanted to hear. He had the money. He told her he was ready to settle the debt, but he didn't want to do it at the restaurant or in a crowded public space. He suggested a meeting later that evening, framed as a way to finally put the tension behind them without the prying eyes of their coworkers. Sandy, ever the optimist and a woman who valued her word, agreed without hesitation. She didn't see the red flags in the odd timing or the shifting location. In her mind, this was a transaction of honor. She trusted Alejandro because they had shared shifts, shared jokes, and shared a workplace that felt like family. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows over Charlotte, Sandy got into her four-door 2003 Toyota Corolla and headed toward the designated meeting spot. She likely felt a sense of relief. The $1,000 was a significant sum, and having it back meant she could focus on her own plans for the future. What Sandy didn't know was that the meeting had been choreographed down to the minute. Alejandro wasn't alone. Amariba Abby Feaster was with him, acting as the silent witness and accomplice to a plan that had transitioned from a dark fantasy into a cold reality. Alejandro had secured a handgun, a .45 caliber pistol that he had acquired through his various peripheral connections. He hadn't brought it for protection. He had brought it to serve as the final arbiter of his debt. The two of them waited for Sandy, their own car positioned for a quick exit, their minds already miles away from the city they were about to leave in a state of shock. When Sandy arrived, the interaction began under the guise of normalcy. There was no immediate violence, no sudden outburst of rage. Alejandro was a master of the slow burn, maintaining the facade of a friend just long enough to ensure his victim was completely vulnerable. He convinced Sandy to leave her car and get into the vehicle with him and Abby. He told her they needed to go to a different location to pick up the cash, or perhaps he used the excuse of a final, friendly drive to clear the air. Sandy, trusting to a fault, stepped out of her Corolla, a car that would later become a grim landmark for investigators, and climbed into the back seat. The drive led them away from the flickering streetlights of the city and toward the dense, tangled woods of Cabarrus County. As the urban sprawl gave way to towering pines and gravel roads, the atmosphere inside the car must have shifted from strained, polite conversation into a terrifying silence. Alejandro drove with a singular purpose. He pulled off into a secluded area, a place where the sounds of the highway were muffled by the thick brush and the chorus of cicadas. This was the stage he had chosen, a place where no one would hear the confrontation and no one would see the betrayal. In the darkness of the woods, the mask finally slipped. There was no money. There was no intention of a peaceful resolution. Alejandro turned to Sandy, and the friend she thought she knew was replaced by a cold-eyed stranger holding a .45 caliber pistol. The details of the final moments remain a harrowing puzzle, but the forensic evidence later told a story of brutal efficiency. Sandy was shot in the head, a single devastating blow intended to end her life instantly. She didn't have a chance to plead, to run, or to fight back. In an instant, the woman who had spent years helping others was discarded like an unwanted piece of history. Alejandro didn't stop at the killing. With a chilling level of detachment, he and Abby moved to hide the evidence of their work. They dragged Sandy's body into a shallow ravine, covering her with brush and leaves in a hurried attempt to buy themselves time. There was no remorse shown in the aftermath. There was only the logistical problem of escape. They returned to Sandy's car, the Toyota Corolla, and drove it back toward the city, but they didn't leave it there. They needed to create a trail of breadcrumbs that led away from their true destination. The level of premeditation involved in the hours following the murder was staggering. Alejandro and Abby didn't just flee, they orchestrated a disappearance. They took Sandy's car, her phone, and her personal belongings. They drove the Corolla to a location where it wouldn't be immediately found, but would eventually suggest that Sandy had left of her own accord. Then, they turned their sights toward the south. They had a head start, a weapon, and a complete lack of a moral compass. As the morning of August 10th dawned, the Lowe family began to realize something was terribly wrong. Sandy hadn't returned home. She wasn't answering her phone. This was a woman who never missed a shift and never left her family wondering where she was. While her mother and siblings began the frantic process of calling hospitals and filing a missing persons report, Alejandro and Abby were already crossing state lines. They were fueled by adrenaline and the belief that they had successfully cleared the slate. The incident wasn't just the pull of a trigger, it was the total collapse of a social contract. Alejandro Castillo had traded the life of a friend for a few $100s and his own bruised ego. He had used the trust built over countless restaurant shifts to lure a woman to her death. In the quiet woods of Cabarrus County, the ground held a secret that would take days to uncover, while the man responsible for it was already barreling toward the Mexican border. Sandy Lou's death was an act of profound cowardice, a solution born from the mind of a man who refused to take responsibility for his own life. By the time the sun set on August 10th, the investigation was in its infancy, but the damage was absolute. A young woman was gone, a family was broken, and two fugitives were vanishing into the vastness of the American highway system. Alejandro Castillo had committed the ultimate act of betrayal, and in doing so, he had signed his own name to the FBI's most wanted list. The woods were silent again, but the echoes of that Tuesday night would eventually reverberate across two countries for the next decade. The cold calculation of Day X revealed the true nature of the man the FBI would spend millions of dollars to find. He wasn't a criminal mastermind, he was a petty man with a gun who mistook violence for power. As he drove toward the border, he likely thought he had won. He didn't realize that by ending Sandy Lou's story, he had ensured that his own would be defined by the hunt. The humid air of the North Carolina woods held the truth, waiting for the search parties that were already beginning to form, driven by the love of a family that refused to let Sandy simply vanish into the night. When the morning of Wednesday, August 10th arrived, the Lowe household was not filled with the usual sounds of a family readying themselves for the day. Instead, it was draped in an unsettling, heavy silence. Sandy Lee was a creature of habit, a woman whose reliability was as much a part of her identity as her smile. She never missed a shift at Showmars, and she never, under any circumstances, spent a night away from home without a flurry of text messages and phone calls to ensure her mother and siblings knew she was safe. By 8 a.m., that silence had curdled into a cold, sharp panic. Her phone went straight to voicemail, a sound that would eventually become the haunting soundtrack of the next several days. The family's initial search was frantic and grassroots. They called friends, co-workers, and anyone who might have seen her the night before. The name Alejandro Castillo came up almost immediately. Everyone knew Sandy had gone to meet him to collect the debt. When the family reached out to Alejandro and Abby Feaster, they were met with a wall of practiced indifference. The couple claimed that Sandy had never shown up, or that they had met briefly, and she had driven away alone. It was a lie, but at that moment, it served its purpose. It sowed just enough doubt to keep the family spinning in circles for a few precious hours. By that afternoon, the Lowe family had filed a formal missing persons report with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Initially, the case was treated with the standard caution applied to adults who go missing. People sometimes leave of their own volition. They sometimes need a break from their lives. But Sandy's family refused to accept this narrative. They knew Sandy. They knew her car, a distinctive 2003 Toyota Corolla, was as missing as she was. They began a social media blitz, plastering her photo across every local group and news outlet, their desperation acting as a catalyst for a community that had grown to love the young woman. As the days ticked by, the investigation took a dark turn. On Saturday, August 13th, the search for Sandy Lou moved from the neighborhoods of Charlotte to the scorching asphalt of Phoenix, Arizona. A 2003 Toyota Corolla matching the description of Sandy's vehicle had been discovered in an airport parking lot. It was locked, abandoned, and seemingly scrubbed of any immediate clues. The location was a punch to the gut for the investigators and the family. Phoenix was more than 2,000 miles away from Charlotte, a distance that suggested Sandy hadn't just gone for a drive. It suggested a calculated, long-distance flight. While the car was being processed by forensic teams in Arizona, the detectives back in North Carolina were digging into the lives of Alejandro Castillo and Abby Feaster. They found that the couple had vanished at the same time Sandy did. Their social media went dark, their phones were disconnected, and their apartment was empty. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a terrifying picture of a pre-planned escape. The focus shifted from a missing person to a double fugitive hunt, but the most important question remained. Where was Sandy? The answer came on August 17, 2016, in a way that shattered any remaining hope the Lou family held. Acting on tips and a renewed focus on the wooded areas of Cabarrus County, search teams moved into a desolate patch of forest near the town of Midland. The searchers weren't looking for a living person anymore. They were looking for disturbed earth. In a shallow ravine, partially obscured by the heavy summer growth and a layer of discarded brush, they found the remains. It was Sandy. The discovery turned the missing persons case into a homicide investigation. The medical examiner's report was a brutal confirmation of the family's worst fears: a single gunshot wound to the head. There was no evidence of a struggle, no signs that Sandy had seen the end coming. She had been executed and discarded. The cruelty of the act, the fact that she had been left in the dirt while her friends used her car to flee the state, sent a wave of revulsion through the Charlotte community. The search for Sandy had ended, but the search for her killers was just beginning. The discovery of the body galvanized the FBI, who officially joined the hunt. They realized that by the time the body was found, Alejandro and Abby had a nearly week-long head start. Surveillance footage from the Phoenix airport showed the couple, but they hadn't boarded a plane. Instead, they had used the airport as a diversion before heading toward the Mexican border. They were seen on camera crossing into Mexico at the Nogales port of entry just 2 days after the murder. For the Lou family, the search for Sandy was replaced by an agonizing wait for justice. They had to bury a daughter and a sister while knowing that the men who took her life were likely thousands of miles away, shielded by an international border and a vast, unfamiliar country. The community of Charlotte rallied around them, holding vigils and raising funds, but the void left by Sandy was absolute. She was no longer a face on a poster. She was a memory, a victim of a betrayal so profound it defied logic. The search phase of the case revealed the chilling efficiency of Alejandro Castillo's plan. He had used the time it took to find the car and the body to put thousands of miles between himself and the crime scene. He had exploited the natural delays of the legal system to vanish into the shadows of Mexico. The investigation was now an international game of high-stakes hide-and-seek, with the FBI's Charlotte field office taking the lead. They knew they weren't just looking for a common criminal. They were looking for a man who had successfully navigated an escape across an entire continent. The psychological toll on the search teams was immense. Many of the officers had spent days hoping for a different outcome, only to find themselves standing in a ravine in Cabarrus County, looking at the cost of a $1,000 debt. The case had become personal for the city. It wasn't just about a murder. It was about the safety of a community where co-workers are supposed to be friends. The search for Sandy Lou had ended in tragedy, but it had ignited a flame of determination that would not go out for the next decade. The FBI began the arduous process of placing Alejandro Castillo on the 10 most wanted list, a designation reserved for the worst of the worst. They knew that without the public's help and the cooperation of international authorities, the trail would grow cold. As the summer of 2016 faded into autumn, the posters went up in post offices and police stations across the country. The face of the 20-year-old restaurant worker was now a symbol of a manhunt that would span years, borders, and administrations. The search for Sandy was over, but the world was now looking for the man who left her in the woods. The transition from a local murder investigation to an international manhunt occurred with a clinical, chilling speed. Once Sandy Lou's body was recovered from the shallow grave in Cabarrus County, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department realized the scope of the task ahead. They weren't just looking for a local runaway, they were pursuing a man who had successfully crossed an international border before the crime was even fully realized. On October 24, 2016, a federal arrest warrant was issued for Alejandro Rosales Castillo, charging him with unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. This elevated the case to the federal level, bringing the full weight and resources of the Federal Bureau of Investigation into the fold. By 2017, the investigation had reached a stalemate. Despite the recovery of the Toyota Corolla in Phoenix and the identification of Castillo and Feaster on surveillance footage at the border, the trail in Mexico had grown maddeningly cold. Alejandro was not a novice when it came to the geography of northern Mexico. He had family ties in the state of Guanajuato and knew how to navigate the linguistic and cultural nuances of the region to remain invisible. Recognizing that Castillo represented a particularly calculated and dangerous brand of criminal, one who would kill a friend over a petty financial dispute, the FBI took the rare step of adding him to their 10 most wanted fugitives list on October 24, 2017. He was the 516th person to be placed on the list, and a reward of up to $100,000 was offered for information leading to his arrest. The 10 most wanted designation changed the nature of the hunt. It wasn't just about boots on the ground in Charlotte anymore. It was about global awareness. Posters featuring Castillo's youthful face, his dark hair, his slight frame, and the small mole under his left eye were distributed across the United States and Mexico. The FBI worked closely with the legal attaché office in Mexico City, coordinating with Mexican federal authorities to narrow down his possible locations. They knew he was likely working under an alias, possibly in the service industry or construction, melting into the labor force of central Mexico. For the Lou family, this period marked the beginning of a grueling psychological war of attrition. Every time the FBI released a new update or a cold case segment aired on national television, their hopes would surge, only to be met with the crushing silence of another dead end. They had to watch the years go by, 2018, 2019, 2020, while Sandy's room remained a frozen monument to a life cut short. The injustice was a physical weight. While Sandy lay in a cemetery in North Carolina, her killer was breathing the air of a free man, perhaps even starting a new life under a different name. The thought that he might never face a courtroom became a recurring nightmare for her siblings and mother. The investigation, however, never truly went dormant. Behind the scenes, the FBI was monitoring every possible lead. They tracked pings from social media accounts that might have belonged to Castillo's associates. They interviewed distant relatives who claimed to have seen him at family gatherings in Mexico. They followed up on sightings in bus stations and border towns. There were moments of intense activity, raids on small apartments in Guanajuato or San Luis Potosí that yielded nothing but empty rooms and frustrated agents. The long hunt was a series of near misses and linguistic barriers, a game of chess played across two different legal systems. As the hunt entered its 5th, then its 8th year, the profile of the case shifted. Alejandro was no longer the 20-year-old boy who worked at a restaurant. He was now a man in his late 20s, his appearance likely altered by time and the stress of a life on the run. The FBI released age-progressed photos, attempting to predict how the fugitive might look as he aged. They focused on his habits, his love for soccer, his affinity for certain types of music, hoping that a small, human detail would be the key to his undoing. The breakthrough didn't come from a grand betrayal or a high-tech satellite trace. It came from the relentless, grinding pressure of international cooperation and a community that refused to forget Sandy Lou. Over the years, the reward stayed active, and the FBI's Charlotte field office maintained a constant dialogue with Mexican authorities. They were waiting for Castillo to make a mistake, to get too comfortable, to reach out to the wrong person, or to let his guard down in a city where he felt safe. That mistake finally materialized in early 2026. The intelligence began to point toward the city of Aguascalientes, a hub in central Mexico, known for its colonial architecture and bustling industry. Investigators received information that a man matching Castillo's description, though living under a meticulously crafted alias, was residing in a quiet residential neighborhood. The FBI and the Mexican Attorney General's Office, FGR, began a period of intense surveillance. They needed to be certain. They couldn't afford another empty room raid. They watched the man's movements, his interactions, and his routine, waiting for the moment they could confirm his identity beyond a shadow of a doubt. On the morning of January 16, 2026, the long hunt reached its crescendo. In a coordinated operation between Mexican federal agents and the FBI, the man who had been a shadow for nearly 10 years was cornered. There was no high-speed chase, no dramatic shootout in the streets of Aguascalientes. Instead, there was the sudden, overwhelming presence of law enforcement and the realization that the game was over. When the agents confronted him, they didn't address him by his alias. They used the name he hadn't heard in a decade, Alejandro. The capture sent a shockwave back to Charlotte. For 10 years, the city had carried the scar of Sandy Lowe's murder, a reminder that some crimes go unpunished for far too long. When the news reached the Lay family on that Friday morning, the reaction wasn't one of celebration, but of profound, bone-deep relief. The long hunt had ended. The fugitive was in custody. The FBI's 10 most wanted list had one less name on it, and a family in North Carolina finally had the one thing they had been denied since a Tuesday night in August 2016, the prospect of a trial. The investigation now shifted into its final phase, extradition. The legal maneuvers required to bring a high-profile fugitive across the border were complex, but the determination of the U.S. government was absolute. They had spent a decade looking for Castillo. They weren't going to let a single procedural error jeopardize his return. As Castillo sat in a Mexican holding cell, the reality of his situation began to set in. The borders he had used as a shield were now the gates through which he would be marched back to face the consequences of a $1,000 debt and a cold-blooded execution. The investigation and the long hunt was a testament to the fact that while a criminal can run, they can never truly outpace the memory of their victims or the persistence of those sworn to find them. The trial, which commenced in the summer of 2026, became a focal point for a community that had never forgotten the events of August 2016. The prosecution laid out a devastatingly clear timeline, using forensic evidence from the woods of Cabarrus County and digital footprints recovered from the Toyota Corolla found in Phoenix. They painted a picture of a man driven by a chillingly petty motive, a refusal to repay a $1,000 loan to a woman who had shown him nothing but kindness. The most emotional moment of the proceedings came when Sandy's mother and siblings took the stand, their voices steady but laced with a decade of grief, describing the void her absence had left in their lives. Throughout the testimony, Castillo remained largely impassive, his face a mask of indifference that only served to highlight the cold-blooded nature of the crime. When the jury finally returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, the courtroom remained silent, the weight of the moment transcending the need for outburst. The judge's sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole was more than just a punishment. It was a final, ironclad resolution. The man who had spent 10 years running from a debt had finally been forced to pay it in full, not in cash, but in the currency of his own freedom. The case of Alejandro Rosales Castillo stands as a haunting reminder that while the shadow of a fugitive may be long, it is never infinite. The 10 years he spent in the sun of Mexico were not a victory, but a stay of execution, a decade where every siren and every stranger's glance carried the weight of the woods in Cabarrus County. Justice, though delayed by borders and bureaucracy, proved to be as relentless as the family that refused to let Sandy Lou's name fade into a cold case file. Today, the 10 Most Wanted poster is gone, replaced by a finality that echoes through the streets of Charlotte. Sandy Lee is no longer defined by the debt she was owed, but by the peace that was finally won in her name. The long hunt is over. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. 4:30 a.m. in an elite Austin neighborhood. The silence of the night is shattered by the frantic, persistent barking of dogs. Ted Shaughnessy grabs his pistol and steps into the hallway to protect the life he spent 30 years building. In mere seconds, he will lie on the kitchen floor in a pool of his own blood. To the world, the Shaughnessy family was the definition of success. Owners of a prestigious jewelry business who once rescued a 16-month-old boy from a Ukrainian orphanage. They called him the absolute light of their lives. But 18 years later, that light is extinguished, replaced by a cold, calculating greed. This is the story of a $6 million inheritance, a secret marriage, and a son who chose to become the executioner of his own parents. The story of the Shaughnessy family is one that, for decades, represented the very definition of the American dream, a narrative of self-made success, enduring love, and the kind of community standing that most only ever read about in novels. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in the early hours of March 2018, one must first look back at the foundation of the man who sat at the center of this world, Theodore Shaughnessy. Known to everyone simply as Ted, he was born on February 7, 1963. He was the youngest of 3 boys, growing up in the rugged, sun-drenched landscapes of Arizona, not far from the sprawling city of Phoenix. His brothers, Tim and Tom, recall a childhood defined by a certain restless energy that Ted seemed to possess from the moment he could walk. From a remarkably young age, Ted developed an obsession that would follow him throughout his entire life: speed. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a defining characteristic of his personality. He was a man who felt most alive when the world was blurring past him at high velocity. Whether it was karting as a teenager or racing high-performance cars as an adult, Ted was described by those closest to him as being utterly fearless behind the wheel. This passion for fast living was not, however, a sign of recklessness in his personal life. On the contrary, Ted possessed a grounded, magnetic personality that drew people toward him like a moth to a flame. In the early 1980s, Ted's life took a pivotal turn when he met a young woman named Corey Garman. From their very first meeting, it was clear that they were kindred spirits. They shared a deep, intellectual connection and a set of interests that aligned perfectly. It wasn't long before they decided to intertwine their lives permanently, marrying and eventually making the move to Austin, Texas. It was here, in the heart of Texas, that the couple would build their brainchild, an elite, high-end jewelry business they aptly named Jewelry Gallery. The business was a true partnership in every sense of the word, a delicate balance of Corey's technical expertise and Ted's undeniable charisma. Corey was the silent engine behind the operation. Having studied fine arts and gemology in college, she was a highly skilled appraiser. Her days were spent in the quiet, focused world of gemstones, analyzing the clarity of diamonds and the depth of emeralds, work that was largely hidden from the eyes of the public. Ted, meanwhile, was the unmistakable face of the store. He possessed a rare, innate ability to communicate with anyone who walked through the door. He wasn't just a consultant, he was a master of establishing trust. Within minutes of meeting a stranger, Ted could make them feel like a lifelong friend. By the year 2000, the Jewelry Gallery had become a staple of Austin's elite. The business was thriving, allowing the couple to purchase a stunning home in a prestigious neighborhood just a short distance from their storefront. But despite the beautiful house and the successful business, there was a void in their lives. They desperately wanted to be parents, but they were unable to have children of their own. This longing led them across the globe to Ukraine in the spring of 2000. It was there that they found Nicholas, or Nick, as they would come to call him, a 16-month-old boy who would become the absolute center of their universe. The Shaughnessy's were, by all accounts, extraordinary parents. They fell in love with Nick at first sight, and Ted, in particular, embraced fatherhood with a fervor that surprised even those who knew him best. He became a fiercely caring father, rarely spending a moment apart from his son. As Nick grew, he became the mirror image of his father, handsome, smart, and possessing that same insatiable hunger for speed. Father and son spent countless hours together at racing tracks, bonded by the roar of engines and the smell of burning rubber. But Nick didn't just inherit his father's love for cars. He seemed to have absorbed the entrepreneurial spirit that had built the family's wealth. Even in middle school, Nick was finding ways to make a profit, selling chocolate bars to his classmates. By high school, he had launched a car repair business that was remarkably successful for a teenager, eventually hiring several employees to help manage the workload. To the outside world, the Shaughnessy's were the ideal couple with the ideal son. A family built on love, mutual respect, and a shared drive for success. They had 2 dogs, Bart and Brina, who were treated with the same affection as any human family member, even accompanying Ted and Corey to the jewelry store most days. Ted's reputation in the community was legendary. He was a man of immense generosity, often paying for the groceries of strangers or lending money to friends without the expectation of interest. He helped people not for the recognition, but because he genuinely cared about the well-being of others. It was this huge heart that made his eventual fate so incomprehensible to those who knew him. As 2018 approached, the Shaughnessy family appeared to be standing on the pinnacle of a life well lived, unaware that the very boy they had rescued from an orphanage 18 years prior was now a young man drifting toward a dark and unthinkable path. The story of the Shaughnessy family is one that, for decades, represented the very definition of the American dream, a narrative of self-made success, enduring love, and the kind of community standing that most only ever read about in novels. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in the early hours of March 2018, one must first look back at the foundation of the man who sat at the center of this world, Theodore Shaughnessy. Known to everyone simply as Ted, he was born on February 7, 1963. He was the youngest of 3 boys, growing up in the rugged, sun-drenched landscapes of Arizona, not far from the sprawling city of Phoenix. His brothers, Tim and Tom, recall a childhood defined by a certain restless energy that Ted seemed to possess from the moment he could walk. The trajectory of Nicholas Shaughnessy's life took a definitive and eventually catastrophic turn in 2015 when he met Jacqueline Alexa Edison, known to everyone simply as Jackie. She had recently moved from New Jersey to Texas, and for the 19-year-old Nick, the attraction was instantaneous and all-consuming. After their graduation, the two became practically inseparable, weaving their lives together with an intensity that perhaps should have served as a warning sign. They moved away from the familiar surroundings of Austin to College Station, where Jackie enrolled at Texas A&M University to study engineering, while Nick attempted to carve out a niche for himself as a day trader, working from the comfort of their shared home. To the senior Shaughnessy's, the relationship initially seemed like a natural progression of their son's transition into adulthood. Every weekend, the young couple would make the 2-hour drive back to Austin to visit Ted and Corey, maintaining the outward appearance of a tight-knit, loving family. However, beneath this polished surface, the dynamics were beginning to fray, primarily fueled by the very business acumen Ted and Corey had once admired in their son. While Nick had shown an entrepreneurial streak since middle school, his ventures in the high-stakes world of stock trading were not yielding the same reliable results as his childhood chocolate bar sales or his high school car repair business. The financial bridge between Nick's ambitions and his reality was built almost entirely by his parents' generosity. Ted and Corey had lent their son $30,000, money specifically intended to be a student fund to support his education. They also covered his recurring monthly expenses, including car insurance and gasoline. Even Ted's close friend, Ted Cole, had contributed $5,000 for Nick to invest on his behalf, a testament to the community's collective faith in the young man's potential. But the agreement that Nick would eventually repay these sums began to dissolve as his trading losses mounted, and his spending habits became increasingly lavish. The tension reached a boiling point in the months preceding the tragedy. Ted and Corey grew increasingly frustrated, not just with the lack of repayment, but with Nick's refusal to pursue a traditional university education. They watched with growing alarm as the $30,000 they provided for his future was instead diverted into high-end furniture and fashionable outfits for Nick and Jackie. Every time the couple visited Austin, they seemed to be flaunting new possessions, even as their actual bank accounts were hovering at a staggering balance of less than $2. The parents eventually made the difficult decision to cut off the money flow, issuing a stark ultimatum. Once the remaining funds ran out, Nick would have to find a job and support himself. This decision sparked a serious conflict within the family. Although Nick briefly pivoted, appearing to resolve the issue by starting to return some money, the resentment was merely being driven underground. He felt entitled to the lifestyle his parents had built, and the prospect of manual labor or a desk job was anathema to him. What Ted and Corey did not know, what no one in their inner circle suspected, was that Nick and Jackie had already taken a secretive, monumental step in their relationship. In the summer of 2017, 8 months before the murder, the young couple had secretly married. They kept this union hidden from the very people who were financing their lives, a deception that hinted at a growing disconnect from the Shaughnessy family values. This secret marriage created a them-against-the-world mentality for Nick and Jackie, an insular bubble where their financial desperation could fester into something far more dangerous. The depth of this desperation was revealed only later through digital forensic evidence. While they were portraying the image of a successful young couple to their families and social circles, their private communications told a story of utter ruin. They were being hounded for debts, including a $2,600 sum owed to a neighbor who was threatening to expose Nick's surveillance activities to his parents if he didn't pay up. For Nick, the walls were closing in. He saw his parents not as the loving protectors who had rescued him from a Ukrainian orphanage, but as the gatekeepers to a multi-million-dollar inheritance that he believed he deserved. In his twisted logic, Ted and Corey were no longer family. They were obstacles. He began to fantasize about the $1 million life insurance policies held by each of his parents and the $6 million value of the family home and the jewelry gallery. These weren't just idle thoughts. They were the seeds of a conspiracy. He even began sounding out his few friends, like Spencer Patterson, offering them life-changing sums of money to eliminate his parents. Nick's transformation from a smart, handsome young guy into a cold-blooded conspirator was nearly complete. He had convinced himself, and seemingly Jackie, that the only way to secure their future was to end the lives of the two people who had given him everything. The plan was not a sudden impulse born of a single argument. It was a calculated, cold-blooded maneuver designed to look like a random act of violence in a city where such things were becoming increasingly common. He knew his parents' routines, he knew the weaknesses of their security system, and he knew exactly how to use the blue wall of their own home against them. By late February 2018, the pieces were in place. The son who had been the absolute light in Ted and Corey's lives was now preparing to plunge their world into permanent darkness. Throughout this period, Jackie remained his constant companion and, as Nick would later claim, his primary support system. While she would eventually try to distance herself from the idea of the murder, the deleted messages on her phone suggested she was far more than a passive observer. She was a partner in the lies, a partner in the financial ruin, and ultimately, a partner in the countdown to the early morning of March 2nd. The stage was set for a betrayal so profound that it would leave the Austin community, and the very concept of adoption, reeling in the aftermath. The tragic irony was that while Ted and Corey were planning for their son's future, hoping he would find his way and perhaps even take over the family legacy, Nick was already appraising that legacy in blood. He didn't want the work of the jewelry gallery. He wanted the wealth it generated, and he wanted it now. The love that had once filled the Shaughnessy home was being replaced by a cold, transactional calculation. The fearless man who loved speed was about to be blindsided by a threat he could never have anticipated. The boy he had taught to drive, the son he had refused to part with for even a minute, was now the architect of his demise. On March 2, 2018, the silence of a prestigious Austin neighborhood was shattered by a sequence of events that would leave a community in shock and a family destroyed. It was 4:30 in the morning. a time when the world is typically held in the deepest grip of sleep. Inside the beautiful Shaughnessy residence, Theodore and Corey were peacefully asleep in their bed, a routine they had shared for 30 years. The peace was broken by the frantic, persistent barking of their dogs, Bart and Brina. In a home with pets, such a sound isn't necessarily a cause for alarm. Animals are often stirred by extraneous street noises or scents far beyond human detection. However, something in the urgency of the bark prompted Ted to act. Ted Shaughnessy, a man described by his brothers as completely fearless, did not hesitate. He reached for a .45 caliber pistol he kept for protection and stepped out of the bedroom to investigate the source of the dog's distress. Corey, used to the occasional nighttime barking over the years, momentarily settled back into her pillow, hoping to catch the remaining hours of rest. She had no way of knowing that her husband had just stepped into a lethal ambush. The transition from silence to violence was instantaneous. As Corey closed her eyes, the sharp, unmistakable crack of a gunshot echoed from the kitchen. It was followed rapidly by several more. The woman bolted upright, her adrenaline surging with a terrifying clarity. She grabbed her own weapon, a .357 caliber revolver she kept above the bed, and moved toward the bedroom door. Through the doorway, she witnessed a nightmare. An intruder was approaching the bedroom. Before her eyes, the guest shot her beloved dog, Bart. In a desperate bid for survival, Corey opened fire. She pulled the trigger repeatedly, emptying the magazine in the direction of the uninvited guest. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the ringing of shots. Once her weapon was spent, Corey retreated into the darkness of the bedroom closet, her only sanctuary. Trembling, she dialed 911, her mind racing with the agonizing possibility that the intruder could find her at any moment while she sat completely defenseless. As she spoke with the emergency dispatcher, the sounds of the house were haunting. Corey reported the emergency through tears, hearing low moans coming from somewhere beyond the closet door. A sickening uncertainty took root in her heart. She didn't know if the moans belonged to an injured intruder or if her husband was lying somewhere, dying alone. Driven by love and desperation, she told the operator she was going to go out to check on Ted. However, the dispatcher issued a literal order for her to stay hidden until law enforcement arrived. The wait was an agonizing eternity. For 15 minutes, Corey sat in the claustrophobic darkness of the closet, the silence growing heavier as the moans eventually ceased. She bit her hands until they bled, a desperate attempt to stifle the screams that threatened to erupt from her throat. She clutched her head, praying to God that Ted was still alive, even as the thread of hope began to fray deep within her. Finally, the word came through the phone. The police were near the house. Corey crawled from her hiding place, moving slowly down the hallway toward the front door. Her path led her past the kitchen, and there, the reality of the night took its final, devastating shape. Ted Shaughnessy, the man she had loved for 3 decades, her partner in business and in life, lay dead on the floor. He was surrounded by a pool of his own blood and several spent bullet casings. Moving as if in a thick fog, Corey passed the horrific sight of her husband's body to open the front door for the emergency response officers. But when she swung the door open, the porch was empty. There were no police, and there were no intruders. In a bitter irony of fate, the responding patrol officers had mixed up the house numbers and were currently knocking on the doors of her neighbors. When the police finally reached the correct residence, they found Corey Shaughnessy completely out of control, her body shaking as if gripped by a fever. She was unable to explain the intricacies of what had happened, only pointing into the house and repeating one name, Ted. At that moment, she felt as though her life had reached its end, convinced that nothing, good or bad, could ever matter again. The emergency officers secured the scene, seating a shattered Corey in a patrol car while they inspected the carnage inside. At 5:14 a.m., Theodore Shaughnessy was officially pronounced dead. He had been shot 4 times. As the sun began to rise over Austin, Corey managed to find the strength to place a call to her son, Nick. She told the 19-year-old that his father had just been shot. Nick, appearing to be in a state of absolute incomprehension, tried to pry more details from her, but Corey could only tell him that she needed him by her side. Nick and his girlfriend Jackie immediately set out from College Station, making the 2-hour drive to the home that had, only hours before, been a place of safety and success. They arrived around 8 a.m., beginning a 3-month stay during which they provided support and consolation to a woman crushed by grief. Corey was left alone in a large house for the first time in 30 years, mourning not only her husband, but also the loss of Bart, one of the dogs that had replaced the children they couldn't have. Rumors of the nighttime crime spread like wildfire through the community. No one could fathom why someone would take the life of a man like Ted, a bright person who was widely considered to be at a wonderful age where he should have been enjoying the fruits of his labor. Friends and neighbors rallied around Corey, trying to help her navigate a world without the man who would have given his own life for another. It was a rare gift, and Ted Shaughnessy deserved to live to old age. Instead, someone had decided to destroy a family's life in a single, violent morning. The investigation into the murder of Ted Shaughnessy began in the gray, pre-dawn hours of March 2, 2018, as detectives meticulously combed through the wreckage of a life once defined by order and prosperity. The kitchen, usually the heart of the Shaughnessy home, had been transformed into a cold, clinical scene of carnage. As investigators cataloged the area, they found the first tangible evidence that this was not the work of a lone, desperate individual. 2 different calibers of shell casings were discovered near Ted's body. Ballistic markers for both .40 and .380 caliber rounds were present, a chilling indication that at least 2 shooters had likely participated in the execution. The most perplexing aspect of the scene was the lack of forced entry. The heavy doors remained unmarred, and the locks were intact, suggesting that the killers either possessed a key or were guided by someone with intimate knowledge of the home's vulnerabilities. The only anomaly was found in Nick Shaughnessy's old bedroom. A window was standing open, its protective screen pushed outward as if someone had recently used it as a portal. A single clear fingerprint was lifted from the glass, which was immediately rushed to the lab for testing. In a dresser within that same room, detectives found an empty box that had once held a .40 caliber pistol. To their surprise, this was the only item missing from the entire house. In a residence filled with high-end electronics, fine art, and the personal jewelry of the owners of an elite gallery, the intruders had ignored the traditional spoils of a robbery to take a single weapon, a weapon that was subsequently used to end Ted Shaughnessy's life. This revelation shifted the investigators' focus. If the killers knew exactly where to find a specific firearm in a house containing 20 different pistols, this was no random home invasion. Despite the targeted nature of the crime, the first theory pursued by the police was a robbery gone wrong. The Shaughnessy's were public figures in the world of high-value commerce. Their jewelry gallery sold items worth millions, and the assumption was that someone had followed the wealth back to its source. Corey herself leaned into this narrative, desperately wanting to believe that her husband's death was the result of a failed heist rather than a personal betrayal. However, the house's security system provided a timeline that contradicted the chaos of a botched robbery. The logs showed that the bedroom window had been opened at 4:27 a.m. It wasn't until 17 minutes later, at 4:44 a.m., that the system recorded the sound of glass breaking in the kitchen. For 17 full minutes, the intruders had been inside the home, moving through the shadows. They had ample time to demand the code to the safe or gather valuables, yet they did nothing but wait for Ted to encounter them. When Nick was initially interviewed, he provided investigators with several red herrings that seemed designed to lead them away from the family home. He recounted a story from the 1990s when his father had managed a pawn shop and wounded an armed robber in a shootout. Nick suggested that these criminals might have been released from prison and sought a delayed, bloody revenge. Detectives spent valuable hours chasing this lead, but it quickly turned into a dead end when no evidence placed the former convicts anywhere near Austin. Nick's second lead was even more elaborate, involving a neighbor who had allegedly hired him to surveil her unfaithful husband. Nick claimed he had installed a tracker on the man's car and that the husband might have discovered the plot, hiring hitmen to kill his wife, only for the killers to mistakenly target the Shaughnessy house because both families drove white Mercedes. While the neighbor confirmed that she had indeed paid Nick for surveillance, She dismissed the idea that her life was in danger, and detectives found no proof that the husband even knew he was being watched. As these external theories collapsed, the investigation turned inward, and the blue shield of family loyalty began to crack. For a time, investigators cast a suspicious eye on Corey. They struggled to understand why the killers had left her alive after she fired a volley of shots at them. Furthermore, Corey was the sole beneficiary of Ted's $1 million life insurance policy, and her subsequent attempts to inquire about the payout while the investigation was still active made her appear cold and calculated to the authorities. Corey was devastated to learn she was a suspect. To her, the inquiry into the insurance money was a matter of survival for their struggling business, which was faltering without Ted's charismatic presence. While she was under the microscope, the police finally received the results of the fingerprint found on the bedroom window. It belonged to an employee of a window manufacturing company who lived in Minnesota and had installed the windows years prior. It was yet another dead end in a case that seemed to be built on a foundation of vanishing leads. But then, a detail from Nick's own interrogation resurfaced. He had mentioned how he frequently used that very window as an emergency entrance to sneak in and out of the house without his parents' knowledge. When asked who else knew about this secret entry point, Nick didn't hesitate to name his close friend, Spencer Patterson. This marked the moment the investigation pivoted from the parents to the son. The search for the weapons, the .40 and .380 caliber pistols, became the primary objective. During a follow-up conversation, Nick casually mentioned that he had given Spencer a .380 caliber pistol. When police raided Spencer's car, they found the weapon exactly where Nick said it would be. However, ballistic testing proved it was not the murder weapon. Spencer, realizing he was being framed by his best friend, finally began to speak. He revealed that Nick had not only told him about the window, but had once offered him money to kill Ted and Corey, boasting of a $6 million inheritance that would be his once they were gone. The search for a failed robbery was over. The search for a contract killer had begun. As the detectives shifted their focus toward Nicholas Shaughnessy, the investigation entered a high-stakes phase of digital excavation. The young man's behavior in the days following the murder had already begun to set off internal alarms for the veteran officers. While his mother was paralyzed by a grief that seemed to age her by decades, Nick appeared inexplicably excited by the prospects opening up after his death. He was witnessed joking and laughing with police, and when asked to submit to a gunshot residue test, he performed the movement with a jump like an excited schoolboy. This emotional disconnect, paired with his excessive curiosity about the forensic details of the crime scene, painted a portrait of a son who was performing the role of a grieving heir rather than living it. The breakthrough that would ultimately shatter the Shaughnessy family's remaining illusions came from the very technology Nick used to manage his life. Investigators seized the mobile devices of both Nick and his girlfriend, Jackie, and what they found was a digital trail of betrayal that had been meticulously yet unsuccessfully scrubbed. Although the couple had deleted vast quantities of data, leaving suspicious 2-hour gaps in their usage history, forensic specialists were able to recover a mountain of compromising information. The most stunning revelation was the discovery of their secret marriage certificates. It turned out that the young couple had been husband and wife since the summer of 2017, a fact they had hidden from Ted and Corey while continuing to live off their student fund. This deception was merely the tip of the iceberg. Recovered messages revealed that the newlyweds were in a catastrophic financial state, with bank accounts holding less than $2. They were being squeezed by debts and threats of exposure from neighbors, creating a motive as old as time, greed fueled by desperation. The digital evidence grew more damning with every file recovered. Records showed that Nick had accessed his parents' home security system at 5:39 a.m. on the morning of the murder, nearly 2 hours before he allegedly learned of the shooting from his mother's frantic phone call. He already knew the house had been breached because he was the one who had facilitated the entry. Furthermore, a search of their College Station townhouse unearthed a box of ammunition that matched the .380 caliber casings found in the Shaughnessy kitchen, with exactly 6 bullets missing from the tray. While Nick attempted to point fingers at his friend Spencer Patterson, The interrogation of Spencer provided the final piece of the puzzle. Spencer admitted that Nick had explicitly offered to pay him for killing his parents, boasting that he would inherit a $6 million estate and millions in insurance payouts once they were removed. This testimony transformed the case from a suspicious death into a documented conspiracy for contract killing. The search for the actual hands that pulled the triggers led detectives to surveillance footage from February 28th, just 2 days before the assassination. The cameras captured 2 men entering Nick and Jackie's home. Through these leads, investigators identified 21-year-old Johnny Leon and Arian Smith. When confronted with the mounting evidence, the conspiracy began to unravel from the outside in. Johnny Leon admitted that Nick had offered him $100,000 to carry out the murders. He even revealed a chilling detail. On the day of the conspiracy's inception, Nick had actually driven with Leon to the Austin house, intending to do the deed himself. At the last moment, the son who had been the absolute light of his parents' lives claimed he couldn't do it with his own hands, opting instead to hire professionals to execute the people who had rescued him from a Ukrainian orphanage 18 years earlier. Arian Smith, the second gunman, provided a confession that was as haunting as it was definitive. He admitted to firing the fatal shots at Ted using the family's own .40 caliber pistol, the very weapon Nick had told them where to find. Smith described how Nick had remotely disabled the security system and provided instructions on how to enter through his old bedroom window. By the time the investigation concluded, the robbery was exposed as a cold-blooded hit, orchestrated by a son who viewed his parents' lives as nothing more than an inconvenient delay to his inheritance. For Corey Shaughnessy, the investigation's conclusion was a second death. She had to face the reality that for 3 months, she had shared her home and her grief with the very people who had orchestrated her husband's execution. The legal and psychological collapse of Nicholas Shaughnessy was not a single moment of cinematic drama, but a slow, agonizing unraveling of a meticulously constructed persona. On May 29, 2018, almost exactly 3 months after the scent of gunpowder had first filled the Shaughnessy kitchen, the blue wall of familial denial finally crumbled. Nick and Jackie were arrested and charged with solicitation of capital murder, a crime punishable by death in the state of Texas. For Corey, this was a psychological blow that surpassed even the initial shock of Ted's death. She had spent 90 days sheltering, feeding, and mourning alongside the very people who had appraised her husband's life and found it worth less than a luxury apartment and a car payment. The interrogation and subsequent testimony of the 2 hired gunmen, Johnny Leon and Arian Smith, provided the grisly technical details that Nick's polished exterior had tried so hard to obscure. Arian Smith, perhaps the most haunted of the conspirators, broke down under questioning. He admitted that the weight of the crime had robbed him of sleep and even demanded the death penalty for himself, believing that a life for a life was the only valid currency left to him. It was Smith who confirmed the ultimate betrayal. Nick had not only turned off the home security system, but had provided the exact location of the .40 caliber pistol used to kill his father. The weapon that Ted Shaughnessy had reached for in the dark to protect his family was the very instrument his son had selected for his execution. When the investigators finally confronted Nick with the recovered digital evidence, the deleted messages, the bank statements showing a balance of less than $2, and the records of him accessing the security app moments after the shooting, the young man's defense shifted into a disturbing new territory. Rather than denying the act, he attempted to reframe the assassination as a grotesque act of compassion. According to Nick's later statements, his father had been depressed lately, and by taking his life, Nick claimed he was practically doing him a favor and relieving him of mental torment. He further reasoned that because Corey would be unable to live without Ted, it would be cruel to leave her alive, thereby justifying the attempt on his mother's life as well. This chilling display of narcissism revealed a man who had completely dehumanized his parents, viewing their existence through the lens of his own financial convenience. Jackie's interrogation followed a different path of manipulation. Sensing the walls closing in, she immediately attempted to pivot, placing the entirety of the blame on Nick's shoulders. She told investigators that while she was aware of his nonsense talk about the murder, she never believed he would actually go through with it. However, The digital forensic trail told a more cooperative story. Deleted messages showed her active involvement in the planning and the financial desperation that spurred it. Despite this, her willingness to provide information against Nick became her legal lifeline. The community of Austin, which had once viewed the Shaughnessy's as the ideal family, was left to grapple with the realization that Ted and Corey had unwittingly adopted their own executioner. The boy they had brought from Ukraine to be the light of their lives had spent years calculating the value of their deaths. Even as Nick began to offer a performative repentance in later interviews, admitting he was selfish and had destroyed a perfect life, the hollow nature of his words offered little comfort. He had repaid a lifetime of black ingratitude with 4 bullets and a 3-month masquerade of grief. For Corey, the interrogation's conclusion meant the end of her relationship with her son. She stopped speaking to him the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. In the vacuum left by Ted's absence, she began a ritual of writing letters to Nick. Letters filled with the words of a mother who still loved the child he used to be, but who could never forgive the man he had become. She never sent them. As she watched the legal proceedings unfold, the woman who had once been an expert in the clarity of gemstones found herself staring into a darkness that no light could penetrate. Her son was working on himself in prison, hoping for a forgiveness that his own mercy-killing theory had made impossible. The judicial conclusion to the Shaughnessy tragedy arrived with a mix of heavy sentences and controversial leniency. In April 2021, Nicholas Shaughnessy, Johnny Leon, and Arian Smith entered guilty pleas. Each man was sentenced to 35 years in prison, with the possibility of parole. For the triggerman, Smith, the sentence brought a somber end to a period of intense guilt. For Nick, it was the start of a long reckoning with the black ingratitude he had shown the people who gave him everything. Jacqueline Jackie Shaughnessy's fate followed a different path. In June 2023, she pleaded guilty to attempted conspiracy to commit murder. She received deferred adjudication, meaning she avoids a formal conviction if she completes her probation. Her sentence included just 120 days in county jail and 10 years of probation. As a haunting reminder of her actions, she must return to jail for 2 days every year on the anniversary of Ted's death. While she attempted to return to a normal student life, the digital evidence remains a permanent record of the night she helped turn a son against his father. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.